Good morning, good morning, good morning. Thank you for coming out to our Farming for the Future. This is actually our 16th, I want to say show. It's our 16th event. We would have had 17, but COVID in 2021, we decided not to do a program. So we've been doing this for a while, and I'm really excited about this year's. I feel like this is one of our better programs, and I'm so excited that you guys made the time to come and learn what we have to do. And I just wanted to say something really quick. Somebody called while they were registering, and they were like, "How did you get Neal?" I'm like, "We paid for him." And she's like, "Well, how much do we owe you to come and hear him speak?" I'm like, "Well, it's free. We keep this program free, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we keep this program free for you guys." And I want to have Emily start off. Emily, can we talk about Emily's new title yet, or no?
It's Deputy Administrator.
Okay, Emily's Deputy Administrator. She came in during COVID years with her and Kim over here, and they've been running our district, and they have done a fantastic job. They've expanded our staff. Today you guys are going to hear from all of us what we do. We work with landowners, we educate landowners. We have multiple programs that you guys can hear about and possibly participate in. A lot of us are expert in our field, so please take advantage of the programs that they have and the information they have, and take advantage of hearing what they have to offer and potentially using them. It's our only opportunity that we have to get up in front of as many people to talk to our landowners in Van Buren County, and some of us work in multiple counties, so we have a lot of good things to offer. So I hope you guys enjoy everything we have to say. It's going to be brief from us. Then we're going to have Jen Tank, Dr. Jen Tank from the University of Notre Dame speak, which I'm very excited about. And then we're going to take a 5-minute break, let Neal stretch his legs, and then we'll come back and let Neal speak. He's going to speak about an hour and a half, so take advantage of that break, get some more coffee, get a scone before they're gone, and enjoy the show.
Thanks, Colleen. Yes, so like Colleen said, welcome everybody. Good morning. We're so glad you're here. Hopefully you have been able to go through the materials in front of you at the tables. Those are all take home for you, pen and paper for notes if you need it, an agenda to keep you on track. We did build in breaks throughout the day, so as Colleen said, be sure to take advantage of those. With that, we'll go through a few housekeeping things. First off, we're so grateful to the Van Buren ISD and their team here at the Conference Center. You'll see Andrea and Tony making everything happen today. We're just so grateful to have them host us. It's an excellent facility, and we hope you enjoy it today. With that, we just ask that you would keep your phones on silent or vibrate so that we don't distract speakers or make it difficult for folks to hear when they are presenting. Additionally, restrooms are back out across the hallway that you came in on. Women's is on my left, so closer to the main doors, and then men's is over on my right. Refreshments are in the back. We've got some scones, which hopefully you've all gotten to already. If not, there is a brief break coming up, but feel free to get up as you need to throughout the day. We have soda and water in the coolers that are near the coffee pots. If you need anything, just flag any of us down that you see here before you. With that, we will also be doing lunch at 11:30. It's going to be in this room here. The way you will get there is to go out these back doors that you came in through, hook around towards the main doors, and there's a long hallway. We'll make a line that way, and then we'll flow through and come back through these doors to get out. We'll remind you of that when lunchtime comes, but just for some bearings right now. Additionally, we ask that there is no smoking at this facility, outside or indoors, as this is a school facility. We have Wi-Fi available, which I think you can see on the screen what the guest ID is. There is no password, but it will prompt you to accept, so if you're in need of that and you don't see this later, please let us know. Additionally, we will have an evaluation slide going around. There's a QR code on the screen when we have those rolling. We also have paper copies available. It really helps us to know how we're doing and what would be more beneficial to you next year if you fill those out. So please take 5 minutes to do that at the end of the day. And once again, thank you so much for being here. If we would go to the next slide, please, Colleen. So Colleen mentioned that Kim and I are part of the management team for the district, but what you may not know is that we are run by a locally elected board of 5 members. So many of our board members are here today. If any of you want to wave, I think I see a few of you. Yes, yay, they're all here, wonderful. So our board is Bill Van Tassel, Carl Dreskovich, Jan Peterson, Ron Klein, and Paulette Brabarski. Several of our board members are farmers, they're growers right here in Van Buren County. So they definitely have their ear to the ground and want to make sure they know what's important to all of you, and they have a vested stake in how ag proceeds in this county. So we're very proud to have them and have such an active board that is supportive of programs just like this. And with that, I want to pass it over to Kim to talk a little bit about how today's going to go and how we got here.
So I'm the money lady. So I'm pretty blunt and not nearly as charismatic and intelligent as the rest of them up here. But I'm here to tell you about our bang for our buck. Here in Van Buren County, we have a 3-processed, a 3-stage, a 3-tiered funding strategy. First one being grants. We take federal, state, and local grants and optimize those. The second thing we get is we have a millage here in Van Buren County that our voters decided was an important thing to fund, and we agree with them. So that's at the second tier. And the third tier is what we call fee-for-service or private funding. For this event today, we did get an awful lot of sponsorship money. That's how we're able to bring in speakers that cost money. And we also have an amazing team of people that work on our grants. And all these grants have a certain amount of admin money. And that admin money, we turn around and we reinvest right back into this program or into this county. And I did want to point out, we are also highly committed to agriculture. As the major landowners in our county, we feel that you guys make the biggest impact on what we do. That's why we spend almost 40% of our money on you. That's a big number for a conservation district. Comes out somewhere around $450,000 in the form of incentives, programming, and education. So we really do invest in you, and we hope that you take this back and you can do something great on your land with it. And with that, I am to introduce Alex Florian.
Hello, my name is Alex Florian. I'm the coordinator for the Southwest by Southwest Corner SYSMA. We are your go-to source for information on invasive species here in Van Buren as well as Berrien and Cass counties. So if you have any questions about invasive species, you need help with any invasive species issues, feel free to reach out. I'll be here all day. I'm going to pass it over to Abby, who is our strike team coordinator.
Thanks, Alex. Hello, everybody. I am Abby Bristol. I am the strike team coordinator for the Southwest by Southwest Corner SYSMA. And in addition to site visits that Alex does, I am managing invasive species on different properties, whether it's helping municipalities manage their invasive species, our partners of land conservancies or private landowners. This year, we are also trapping for spotted lanternfly, third picture on the slide here. Spotted lanternfly is definitely a agricultural pest and something we want to keep an eye out for. So us as well as other partners are looking for that this year. But if you have any questions about managing invasive species, please come talk to me. Thank you. And then I'm going to pass it off to Callie.
Hi. So my name is Callie. I'm the Recycling and Materials Management Coordinator at the district. So some of our big programs that we like to push for our farmers are our clean sweep pesticide collection. So that's in partnership with Berrien County, where if you have large amounts of pesticides to get rid of that you are no longer in need of, you can take those things to the collections throughout the year. So there's 2 per summer. We also recycle the pesticide containers, so clean, empty containers we'll take by appointment. So you can contact me. I have handouts out in the hall as well for that information. But again, that's just by a on-call basis. So we just make an appointment, meet in Pawpaw, and we're able to recycle those containers for you. And then we also offer large tire recycling events as well. So we offer 2 locations per year, including Pawpaw and South Haven. and those are all free of service for our event. And new this year, we are looking to do a pesticide container pickup program. So if you're interested in that, there is a sign-up form out in the hall. We'll be partnering with MEAT to come out to farms during your busy season to get those out of your way rather than having to hold them and bring them to us. So if you're interested, again, that's just a pilot program this year, but let us know by signing up at our booth out in the hallway. Next, I'll pass it off to Jacob Diljak.
Hi, I'm Jacob Diljak. I'm the outreach coordinator, and two programs that I work in are the Food, Farm, and Fun Guide of Van Buren County, in that we advertise local food, outdoor recreation, and local festivals. We have a lot of discounts available, and it's a great way to get your business out there. We send our guides to Michigan Welcome Centers, and then we distribute all around in county as well. If you want to know more about that, just come up to me and talk to me. I'll be running around taking photos. Also, our tree sale is going on right now. Pre-orders are due April 7th. We sell native tree, shrub, dune grass, and also tree sale accessories. It's a great way to get some good plants while fundraising for all the programs that we do. And also, if you do have questions on that, again, just flag me down. There's also a QR code that you can scan, or you can just go to vanburencd.org/shop/. And then I will introduce Lucas next.
Thank you, Jacob. My name is Lucas Hartman. I've been with the district for almost about 5 years, and my role is to help landowners, forest owners, ag producers, livestock owners, and stuff like that find different options for federal and state funding for these conservation practices. So it's a very broad set of programs, and we can make it apply to almost any sort of agricultural operation. So if you learn about a couple of things today, or you've got some things in mind, or maybe you worked with a beef tech or another one of us here on a different conservation issue, come talk to me at some point. We can see if there's anything that we can do through the Farm Bill or other options to try and fund some of these things if cost starts to become an issue for some of these different conservation practices. So that's really it. Like I said, if they're broad programs, it would take me a while to talk about it, but we can try and help make it specific to you guys. That being said, I'd like to introduce my partner, Gabe.
I am Gabe Francisco. I also work with Lucas at the NRCS and Conservation District. I do more of the livestock and grazing contracts. So if you have something in that field, I'd probably be the one you're talking to. A lot of the other things will go to Lucas because he's just been there for a lot longer than I have. I've been here for 5 months. So hi, everybody.
My name's Kyle Mead. I am the meat technician for Van Buren. I've been at the district for 18 years. And I'm pretty sure many of your faces have heard me talk about beef for the last however many shows that you've attended. We've done 16 of them. I'm here to help you, and along with all the other meat techs that are over here in this little kind of cluster. Our job is to come out and evaluate your farming practices and let you know where there might be issues or might be risks. We try to help you mitigate risk on your farm. Because we do that, if you decide to get verified, then you get some legal protections that say that if there's ever a release, it's an accident and you can't be fined or penalized. There's a lot to talk about in 2 minutes, so grab me and I will explain in more detail. But it's free, it's confidential, it's non-regulatory. We're never going to tell anybody we'll be fined on the farm. We're there to help you. And so the best way to get that process started is to have one of us on the farm. For a little bit of bribery, I know a lot of people like RUP credits. If you get us out on the farm the first time, we can give you a good amount of RUP credits just for listening to us and letting us evaluate your farm. So last but not least is Erin, who's the only person that's been at the district longer than I have.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm Erin Fuller. I'm the Water Quality Projects Manager for the Conservation District, and I've been here for almost 20 years. So you've probably seen my face once or twice. We have a little ag and water quality team. We have Colleen, myself, and Carly Southland, who's in the back of the room, who has done a lot of the background work today to get this conference going, so big thanks to Carly. We work on grant-funded projects. Right now we have 3 different grants that all tie together agriculture and water quality in some way. They're all a little bit different. They're all different funding sources and all have different requirements. But we are always trying to find that connection of what is good for water quality and what is good for farmers. How can we connect those 2 things that are crucial to our economy and our health in this county especially. We have sort of three main things that we do to accomplish that. We do education programs like this today. We have field days throughout the year, small grower meetings, all kinds of different educational activities. If there's something you'd like to see us do in this county, education-wise, talk to us. We would love to hear your ideas. You're the folks we want to get ideas from. And fill out your evaluation with those ideas as well. So we do education. We do on-the-ground practices. We provide cost share for conservation practices. So again, if you have conservation practices that you're interested in trying, anything new and innovative, come talk to us. If we don't have a grant that funds it now, we'd like to write a grant that funds it in the future if it's something you're interested in. We're always kind of looking for the new things to try out and see what works. Not everything works in every place, so we like to try a bunch of stuff and see what does. So education, on-the-ground practices. Our third main thing that we do is research. We have a lot of partners. We have Michigan State University. We have University of Notre Dame are a couple of our biggest research partners. And we're trying to see which of these conservation practices work the best in the field. You know, there's university setting research, which we're also working with these folks on, but then we want to see what actually works on the ground, works for farmers in real life situations. So those are the three main things we're doing. I want to talk super quickly about, do you have the next slide? Oh, there we go. I want to talk super quickly about one project that we're doing. This is a grant funded by USDA and again partnered with University of Notre Dame on antimicrobial resistance. I mean, what is more exciting than that? But this is super important. You've probably heard about antibiotic resistance and what a problem that is if you develop antibiotic resistance. You know, you try to take your penicillin and it doesn't work anymore. And that's not good for human health and it's not good for animal health. It's not good for any of us. So we're finding that actually this antimicrobial resistance can spread throughout the environment. And we are trying to figure out how that happens and how to prevent that, slow it down, mitigate that. So that's what we're working on and doing some university research, doing some in-field research and seeing what we can do. Basically, manage your manure very carefully. It's super important. You know, we don't want the bacterial load from manure getting into our waterways, but now we're finding that there may be antimicrobial resistance that gets into our waterways as well. So be very careful how you apply manure, when you apply manure, having buffers in those areas. But that's just one example of kind of the research that we're working on to figure out what tools we can provide you so you can make the best management decisions on your farm for everybody's health. And I'll pass it on to Colleen to wrap us up.
Thank you guys, we're almost there, I promise. Just real quick, I was gonna just talk a little bit off of what Erin was saying about the grants that we have currently. Just a little plug for that. We still have cost share money for cover crops, filter strips. We might be out of money for no-till. And then grass waterways, and then drainage water management. Does anyone know what drainage water management is? Oh, just so few of you. There we go. Are you gonna talk about that a little bit? Okay, she's not gonna talk about that. I'm gonna talk about that. So this is a water control structure right here. We put these at the edge of fields, and you can see right here, here's the outlet for that. What we can do is we can back up, they're like plates. We can back them up and have water held into our field. What that does is it reduces the flow of water, and we can open those up in the spring and the fall when farmers need to get on the field and manage. And what we're finding with this research is that it was reducing the flow, thus reducing the nutrients and the potentially E. coli and things like that running off the farm into our water bodies. So it's something that we're looking at. We only have about 6 of these in the county. We're doing a lot of research on them, and they're a great conservation practice, maybe not for everyone, but for people, especially if they have manure. So we are talking a lot about livestock and manure today, so I wanted to showcase this a little bit. It was a high flow day, so the ladies had to pull samples from the top. Typically they're pulling samples from the tile outlets down here. So that's Notre Dame, that's Emma, and that's Carly out there. They go out every other week and sample all year long, rain or shine, snow, sleet, some terrible weather. So thank you ladies so much for helping gather that data for us. So just going back to the cost share a little bit, these are the areas that we're working in. So you can see we're right now we're both in Van Buren County and Berrien County. So this is the Hartford, Waterville area. So if you guys are farming in that area and you guys did not know about our program, now you do. And if you're interested in working with us, just let us know. So that's our program. So now we can get started on what you guys are going to expect out of today. So believe it or not, we've had Neal here before. I was able to talk him into coming back. He came in 2016 and we talked a lot about foundations. Well, in the last few years, I feel like we need to go back a little bit to that. I've been around this is my 11th season. I'm starting here at the district. And when I first started about a decade ago, soil health was so new to our farming world. It was a buzzword. People were excited to hear about it. Lots of people came out. They weren't always doing the practices. Some people were doing the practices. And since then, it's exploded and it's become very trendy. A lot of you guys have tried these soil health practices, the cover crops and no-till. Some of you guys have stuck with it. Some of you guys have not stuck with it. So for today, I wanted to bring us back to the basics a little bit more. Because what I've seen with some soil health people is they sometimes forget the component that Neal talks about today. The fertility component. The basics of understanding managing nutrients on the farm. So I wanted to get back to that a little bit. I wanted to bring Neal back. I think it's very foundational. I've learned a lot in the last 10 years, and for a long time I thought cover crops are going to save the world. But it's just one tool in the toolbox. And it's a great tool, and we're going to talk about that today also. But we still need to fertilize properly and manage our soil properly and balance our soil properly. So I really wanted to get that foundation, revisit that foundation for you guys because I find it so important. Last night I had the pleasure of meeting with a couple farmers and Neal at dinner. And one of the farmers put me on the spot a little bit and he's like, what does getting high yields have anything to do with soil health and water quality? And it was a good question. I had to think about that. But what I'm coming to realize is that if you guys are going for high yields and you guys are using lots of inputs to get those high yields and you have imbalances in your soil, your efficiency is not going to be at its greatest. And you're not going to be able to get those nutrients that you put in, and that's when it becomes a problem in our water. That's when it becomes a problem that we're not using everything we need if we're not balanced and we're not able to access those fully. So I think it is very important. It's one of the components that we need to talk about. And so that's why I brought Neal back. If we're going to go for these high yields, let's do it right. Let's balance our soils. Let's understand how our soils work. So Neal's going to blow your mind today. I'm very excited for that. And we have so many other speakers here that are going to help put those pieces of the puzzles together. We are still talking the story of soil health, but we are doing it a little bit conventionally with going back to the basics of nutrient management. So we will get to no-till in a couple sessions. We will talk cover crops in a couple sessions. We will continue to talk about nutrient management and manure management, which is very important. And it all comes back to improving our soil quality, our water quality, and our overall sustainability of our farms, which is what we care about. So the other thing I want to talk about is the credits. Kyle already talked about the MEEP Phase 1 credits. So you guys can get that just for being here and filling out his form. And the other one is RUP credits. It's so funny, I didn't get a ton of questions on that. We didn't know how many RUP credits we had when we sent out the brochure. And almost nobody asked me how many credits this conference is offering. But we're offering 3 this year. Unfortunately, those credits don't start until the afternoon. So if you guys do need credits, you'll have to stay through the afternoon, which is great because we have a great program in the afternoon also. So that's how you will get those. And I'm tempted to not let you guys get RUP credits if you don't fill out your evaluation. So that evaluation is so important to us. So please consider doing that. You're going to talk about the slide? Yeah. You're going to talk about the slide? Okay, good. Let's silence our phones, everyone. No problem. It happens. I'm sure mine is not silenced over there, so I will do that next. I just wanted to take a moment. We talked a little bit about how we fund this program, right? So we had so many donors, sponsorship come in for this program this year. And it was really helpful. We have a wonderful lunch that we're going to pay for with the money for that. We're able to bring Neal. We're able to bring other speakers in from out of state to come and speak. So we really appreciate the effort of the organizations that support us here. So I wanted to just note how many people gave us sponsorship this year, and I just wanted to really thank everyone for believing in the program that we put on and supporting us. So with that, we got to switch gears and get Jen up here and get started. We're really excited to have Jen Tink here. Jen, you know, we've been working together 7 years. It's been great. So we actually approached Jen. We asked for a meeting. I heard about all this work she's doing down in Indiana. And Indiana is kind of this, they have a lot of ag down there. And they are known to kind of be the leaders of some of these soil health practices. They kind of have to. They've drained a lot of their wetlands. Sorry, I'm like dogging on Indiana a little bit. They've drained a lot of their wetlands. They have some water quality issues. So they have been kind of the leaders in some of these soil health practices. And Jen was working down in 2 different watersheds, which I didn't talk about what a watershed is. A watershed is just an area of land that drains to a specific water body. And that's how we write all of our grants. They're all watershed specific. You guys are currently in the Pawpaw River watershed. But Jen was working down in Indiana in 2 watersheds, working with farmers, putting practices on the ground, collecting research from that. She was looking to see if cover crops work. Do cover crops even make a water quality difference? And I was like, I want that. I want that in Michigan. So we sat down with Jen and I said, will you write a grant with us and come to Michigan and do this research? And that was 8 years ago. We wrote 2 grants now? Well, more. We wrote 2 main grants about this, collecting water quality data. So we'll let Jen speak all the way from South Bend, Indiana. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, well, this is an intimidating room. Wow, side to side. I'm going to stand in the middle. Thanks, Colleen, and thank you to Erin for the invitation to speak today. I'm an ecologist. I'm at the University of Notre Dame, but I'm a Michigander by birth. I'm from northern Michigan originally, so it's just a pleasure to work in Michigan, to talk about data that were collected in Michigan. And today I'm just going to tell you about one tool in the toolbox that we've been working on. That's cover crops, because Colleen said talk about cover crops this time. We've also been working on the water quality benefits of drainage water management, floodplain construction via the 2-stage ditch. So we have a number of other tools in the toolbox, but today I'm going to focus on cover crops. And Colleen gave me this sort of bold title. I never would have titled a talk so boldly, but it's true, and we have to aspire. So farmers can solve the water quality problem, or at least be a big part of that solution. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'm going to start the story where we started more than 10 years ago in Kosciuszko County with a project working in 2 different watersheds, the Chateau Ditch watershed to start, and then the Kirkpatrick Ditch watershed a little farther west. And that was a story about cover crops. And so I'm going to show you the data that we've been collecting long term there on the impact of watershed scale cover crops on water quality. And then, as Colleen said, we don't get many. It's like being asked on a date. Doesn't happen very often. And Colleen called and said, will you write a grant proposal with us to do cover crops in Michigan at the watershed scale on working lands like you did in Indiana? And that was just, it's been a pleasure. We're going to talk about this work in the Pawpaw, in Pine Creek, Mill Creek. And so I'll show you those data at the second part of the talk. I couldn't start a talk really without the motivator for why we do the work that we do. And that's because the Midwest gets a very, I'd say kind of a bad rap from folks further down south in the Mississippi River Basin, at the Gulf of Mexico, at the outlet of the Mississippi River, where we often see low oxygen dead zones that are caused by excess nutrients being carried from the upper Mississippi River Basin, which is this whole area here, and this part gets focused on a whole lot. The excess nitrogen that's delivered causes problems with algal blooms and subsequent dead zones every year. Then along came around 2017, we started hearing the same sorts of algal bloom issues happening in western Lake Erie Basin. This time, instead of attributing it to nitrogen, they attributed it to dissolved phosphorus. But both nitrate nitrogen and dissolved phosphorus are key nutrients for crop productivity. So it puts sort of a bullseye on agriculture, and I really felt like there was work to be done in showing how agricultural conservation can be part of the solution. So the issue is that excess nutrients go from fields into waterways. They're carried downstream. They fuel algal blooms just like fertilizer fuels your grass to grow faster. But after those algal blooms bloom and turn the system green, those algae die and decompose, and in that decomposition process, oxygen is robbed in the water column, and you get this water column hypoxia, or low oxygen, that basically kills anything that's left there. So it's a real challenge for the fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico. Drinking water issues in western Lake Erie Basin made the news for Toledo. So it's a real high-profile issue. And the key times are runoff periods that have to do with either storms or spring snowmelt. And that's when we're really vulnerable to losing nutrients from fields to waterways. And so cover crops have been the tool of choice, I think a fantastic tool to keep nutrients on the fields where they belong, keep them out of waterways, and they're providing that vegetative cover. I think of it like a cozy blanket over the soil in the fallow season. And then during the cash crop growing season, you do what you do. But in this off season, having some protective cover does so much good for keeping those nutrients on the fields. And I'm going to show you data. Because what I've learned about talking in front of farmers and landowners is that you don't want to be told with just a bunch of pretty pictures. You really do want to see the data. I feel like you're some of the greatest experimentalists around, and you use data in your own production systems. So I'm going to show you quite a bit of data today. But just to show you a picture that kind of gives you some perspective, this erosion on bare fields is a real problem, especially when you have just a little bit of gradient or really strong precipitation events. And winter cover crops can reduce those nutrient losses from fields to adjacent streams by keeping cover on the ground. Those cover crops take up nutrients. They have deep, deep root systems. They increase soil organic matter. I'm going to show you some data on that slowly and steadily. But what you see above ground is just the tip of the iceberg. Below ground is where the magic happens, and it can happen very deep into the soil profile. And even when someone says, I had a crappy cover crop year, look how scraggly this stuff is, it's not doing any good. When we measure the tile drain outflow from those fields, we see nutrient reductions. We see that those nutrients are staying on the field, and that's because of what's happening below ground. So what I want to talk to you about first is the Indiana Watershed Initiative, the project in Kosciuszko County that I mentioned. It's a long-term study on watershed scale implementation of cover crops. Really key point that I want to make is these are working lands. Certainly Notre Dame does not own any farmland. So it's not, but these aren't university farms in any way, shape, or form. This is real working land where we've come in and offered to pay for the cost for cover crops and then let it go and basically monitored the water quality changes that happen after cover crop planting. This was funded initially through a USDA Regional Conservation Partnership Program, the RCPP. That program is still going. We were in the first round of funding of that, and it truly was a game changer for doing watershed scale conservation. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is the planting of winter cover crops, how it improves soil health, how it decreases nutrient loss out of those subsurface tile drains, and finally how it improves water quality, keeping leaky nutrients on fields during the fallow season in winter and spring. So I'm going to show you some data, and I'll have this little symbol, that's my soil symbol. Then I'm going to show you some tile drain data, and then finally I'll end at the watershed outlet, which is the place that sort of the Gulf of Mexico or Western Lake Erie or Lake Michigan would care about. Okay, so I think the first two, though, are very relevant at the farm scale because the fertilizer is what y'all pay for and you want to keep on your fields. Okay, so the Indiana Watershed Initiative is a tale of two watersheds. The Chateau Ditch watershed here is kind of shaped like a boot. The outlet's up here. And then the Kirkpatrick Ditch watershed a little bit farther west. 3,200 acres for Chateau. Kirkpatrick is about double the size, 6,400 acres. The Chateau Ditch was mostly no-till when we started work in the watersheds. They were already sort of on the road in terms of conservation practices. Kirkpatrick, more traditional tillage in that watershed, so it was a newer thing to incentivize cover crops there. The soils are kind of similar, generally similar, mostly fine loamy soils, but the issue in Kirkpatrick is it had a little bit more clay in it, in the soil, so a little bit different soil setting between the two watersheds. That's fine with us. This is the way the real world works, and we want to see if cover crops, no matter where you apply them, can work. And what we did is really a watershed scale implementation. On the Chateau Ditch, we got the coverage up to 68%. At our highest year was 68% coverage in the watershed. Anybody know what Indiana's average for cover crops is? Last 5 years average? Anyone?
15.
Wrong. Too high. 5. Too low. It's 10%. About 10%. Okay. Michigan, I have to say, a little bit lower than that average, 5-year average. But the point is, and all I make is not to, Indiana, Michigan, we've all got some work to do. The point is, getting it up to this scale is one, kind of unprecedented at the watershed scale, and two, it's probably where we need to be if we want to start talking about watershed scale impacts. Okay?
What's the countrywide average?
Oh, well, all I know is in Indiana, they say we're leading the way in cover crops. So some less than 10%. Yeah. So we do have we're leading the way on a long road, I guess, is what we would say. And I'm not even sure if Indiana is still leading the way, to be honest. So Jamie, you could probably tell us.
Texas.
Okay, Texas. It's kind of beat down Texas. In the Kirkpatrick, as I said, the cover crops were a newer idea. We got up to 30% coverage in Kirkpatrick, which, given that's 3 times the state average, we felt like that was pretty good. It's still, a long way to go. I just wanted to put it in perspective in a way that Notre Dame makes sense. I present this to students. Football fields. What we were planting is about 2,300 football fields a year in cover crops. So that shows you kind of the scale we're working at to try and see those water quality benefits. So let me tell you how we did that. Well, first thing is multi-year sampling year-round. I think anybody who does this kind of work pretty soon learns that if you only sample sometimes, some parts of the year for 1 year or 2 years, you're gonna miss it. You're simply gonna miss it. These are hard signals to see in light of environmental variation. So we're sampling soils 2 times per year in the fall after cash crop harvest, and which is normally when folks soil sample, and then also in spring right before cover crop termination. Comparing cover crop versus no cover crop fields. So I'm using CC for cover crop, no CC for no cover crops. And we looked at what I'm going to present to you today is soil nitrate, soil test phosphorus, and soil organic matter. We also sample water every 14 days. I say my students have been sampling water every 14 days year round. We're going on 9 years of data now. So we sample tile drain outlets that drain fields, so about 36, about 2 per field. Sample at both watershed outlets, so at the bottom. We analyze for the 2 leaky nutrients of concern, nitrate and dissolved reactive phosphorus. And then we also have to have flow, because it's not just about the concentration in that water, it's about how much water is coming out. And so we do tile drains, we do instantaneous flow, and it's with a bucket and a stopwatch, very high tech. And then we have continuous flow with USGS gauges at the outlets. So to start with the data, this on the left is always going to be the Chateau Ditch watershed. On the right, I'm going to show you Kirkpatrick. So the idea is to show you that it can work in both watersheds, but sometimes these watersheds differ. So here's soil nitrate going all the way from the fall of 2013 to the present. And then there's the grand mean for both of these watersheds. And what you can see, comparing no cover crops to cover crops, those green dots are generally lower than the brown dots. So in both watersheds, soil nitrate was consistently lower in fields with cover crops, but it does bounce up and down annually, and it really depends on the year. So for example, in the Chateau Ditch watershed in 2018 and 2019, very wet years, we saw some overlap, some merging of those signals of cover crop versus no cover crop. But if you take the data in total, compute those grand averages, you see that you have a nice reduction in soil nitrate with cover crops. The other thing that varied year to year to year is cover crop biomass. How well those cover crops did. There's the Chateau record on top, the Kirkpatrick record on the bottom. And you can see this up and down, or sometimes it's trending. These are means across all the sample fields in the watershed. Generally, you can see that the cover crops vary year to year, but spring cover crop biomass is higher than fall. So you really get the biggest effect in the spring because of that increased biomass. And what we found when we've taken all these measurements, all these data, and I want you to really focus on this figure here. Here's cover crop biomass as we measured it, above ground biomass, harvesting a square plot and then weighing it and drying it. That's here, and then this is soil nitrate. And what this figure says is it doesn't take much, and I put a little red line, dashed line there at about 1,000 kilograms per hectare. Doesn't take that much, and nitrate, soil nitrate just drops, right? So yes, you're gonna get this variation, but put something on the ground and have it grow at all, and you've got a good shot of lowering your soil nitrate because it's tied up in biomass, which means it's not gonna leak out in the subsurface tile drains running into the stream, okay? So people focus a whole lot on this biomass number, but actually it doesn't take much to just really cover that soil, hold that nitrogen in place, and keep it from running off. Nitrate is incorporated in the cover crop tissues. It reduces that leaky runoff, and you terminate it in the spring prior to planting. Okay, let me show you a little bit about soil phosphorus. This was controversial. So in the western Lake Erie Basin, there's been a lot of work done on the effect of cover crops on dissolved reactive phosphorus leaking into western Lake Erie. And there's strong results in certain types of fields, certain soil types, that cover crops actually increase that dissolved phosphorus, which suddenly put a target on the back of cover crops. Basically, are we going to do this as a cost to water quality? Blah blah blah. We said we got to measure it. Well, what we measured in this system, and it's very, very consistent data, is that soil setting matters. See where Chateau starts and where Kirkpatrick starts, very different place in that soil test phosphorus range, but you're getting a steady decrease in soil test phosphorus with cover crops in the Chateau ditch, and no difference in the Kirkpatrick ditch. But I want to point out, no difference means no significant increase. So in terms of soil test phosphorus, the data we measured in Indiana doesn't show harm, and in the case of the Chateau ditch watershed that had quite a lot of soil test phosphorus because of historic chicken litter application, we do actually see the benefit. So soil test phosphorus was consistently about 20% lower in fields with cover crops. Kirkpatrick started lower, no significant change, but late in the study, we start to see a little bit of difference, right? So maybe it takes time. Yeah?
Can you attribute that perhaps to soil texture?
Could be. Yes. Yes, and every field's different. So the watershed setting's different and every field's different, and I'm an aquatic ecologist. So yeah, so it's true, and we've got some of those soil methods. We've got a lot of cations as well, a lot of anions, so we've got the other chemistry, and we're working on a soil phosphorus paper now. And it's magnesium and iron are big differentiators between the two watersheds as well. So there's quite a lot there to explore. So we're on it. Yeah. Okay. Importantly, no increase though in soil test phosphorus with cover crops. Okay, so finally the big number for soil health that farmers care about. Soil organic matter. And I've presented this same figure, and it doesn't look compelling, does it? Those are all the fields in this case I'm just showing you Chateau, all the fields averaged together. And what do you see? Well, lower, higher, varies through time. If I squint, does it look like the green's going up? You know what I mean? It's not blowing my, it leaves something to be desired. Well, what we found out is that pooling data among fields, in this case, every field has its own signature. Pooling data among the fields just made for variation that's vast, what cover crops are really doing in an individual field. And so it's hard to show the differences. And because cover crops were incentivized, we paid for those cover crops with equip funds. People popped in and popped out with cover crops, right? The consistent use over 8 years, 10 years is only on a few fields. So we decided to look at those few fields where it was consistently cover crops. And this is hot off the press data. We're super excited about. For individual fields that we had 8 years of data, that was 6 fields out of both watersheds. You can see the 4 of these 6 are showing, and 2 are not, but 4 of the 6 are showing a very steady increase in soil organic matter with time. Super exciting. And the slopes of those lines, meaning the rate that soil organic matter is accumulating, they are not different. They're steady at about 0.1% per year. And I know that modelers have told us this, but until I see it with actual data that you measure on working lands, I wasn't going to be convinced. And the issue was, in any 1 year or even 2 years, that 0.1 is sort of within the error of what you measure using the analytical technique of burning off the organic matter. When you get 8 years worth, you suddenly have a change that is steady enough to detect. So it's pretty exciting. Soil organic matter pools are relatively large, and notice they're starting in different places, but the rate you can increase, no matter where you start, is consistent at 0.1% per year. So it takes years to detect, but if you stay with it, that soil organic matter is going to follow. Okay, that's enough of an aquatic ecologist playing soil ecologist. So I'm going to jump back to what I know, which is water quality and what's leading those fields. So we're going to talk about tile drains next. And we measure both the concentration coming out of those tile drains, remember every 2 weeks, as well as the flow. And from that, we can calculate a loss, a mass loss per unit time. And that's really, that mass loss from the field is what we care about. So here are the data. Take home, cover crops reduce tile drain nitrate nitrogen losses, meaning that nitrogen is kept in the field. So they consistently reduce tile drain nitrate, even though from 2016 to 2022, we had wet years, we had dry years, we had intermediate years. That's a whole lot of things working against being able to detect the difference. And yet, predominantly, you'll see that the green bars are lower than the brown. Not always, though. So, annual reduction did vary year by year, but if you average the years where there was significant reduction and take that grand average, it's about 80%. So it's not just doing the job, kind of. It's really doing the job in keeping nitrate nitrogen on the fields, not letting it flow through waterways. But flow does drive nitrate loss. The nitrate moves with the water, and if you've got a wet year and a lot of water moving through that field, very hard, even for cover crops, to show that difference. Okay, now if we move to dissolved phosphorus, again, a very loaded topic, especially with what we've seen in the Western Lake Erie Basin. And here are the data. Cover crops also reduce dissolved reactive phosphorus losses, but it was more variable. But consistent declines, those green percentages are when it was significantly different for all the tile drain data. And you see significant reductions in 9 out of 14 watershed years. So only, more importantly, I would say, for cover crops, especially as they pertain to the Great Lakes, only 1 year did we see an increase. And that was in 2020, which was generally a low export year overall. So the very slight, yeah. Oh, sorry, microphone. Oh my God, thank you. Drop the mic, literally. Okay, so average reduction across these green percentages, 72% lower phosphorus loss from those fields. So at the field, at the tile drain, our little sampler of the field, we're really seeing good reductions with cover crop biomass. But the differences in the field scale losses could be due to the water year. It could be due to differences in management, which we did not talk to the farmers about how they manage their fields. That was farmer choice. All they had to do was just plant cover crops of your choice. And then finally, the soil properties, as I mentioned before, are different among watersheds and among fields. Okay, so finally, what about the watershed outlet that's headed towards Mississippi River Basin or towards the Great Lakes? Well, it takes a lot of data to do these kinds of watershed scale estimates. All the dots represent the grab samples of phosphorus and nitrate nitrogen. The continuous flow is the blue line, and you can see our long-term record for Chateau, and then the Kirkpatrick, which we added in 2015. And we're measuring base flow conditions, we're measuring storm flow conditions in these two ditches. You got a lot of variation in these systems. We also take that multi-year record and model daily export, even though we're only there every 2 weeks, in order to total it all up and get one number per year, which is the export from the watershed. And, as you might suspect, it's not as clean as you'd like. And that's because runoff, which is this top row, varies year to year, including 50 to 100%, 140% increases some years compared to the average. It bounces up and down, and what you see in watershed scale export for both nitrate and SRP compared to our pre-cover crop planting years is that it really depends on the water year. That's why it's so valuable to have both the tile drain data and the field scale data to bolster that what you're doing on the field matters, and it's the environment that's sort of masking it with all the flow that comes through the system in snowmelt and precipitation events. So for nitrate yield, we saw reductions in 5 out of 8 years, and I'm only showing data to 2019. It's bouncy all the way to 2022. But the average in the 5 years that we did see reductions is measurable, but then you don't see it in the other years. So it's really challenging to only measure at the watershed outlet because it reflects interannual variability in runoff. For SRP, more consistent declines, but a lot less SRP is coming off the landscape. So it's probably easier to see those percentage declines because it's not a big amount. There's a lot of nitrate coming off. It's hard to dent that big nitrate pool. 7 out of 8 site years, we saw reductions, and the average was about 51%. Again, very contrasting to the Western Lake Area Basin data. So despite all the differences in cover crop coverage, soil type, fertilizer rates, etc., cover crops as a general tool can reduce nutrient export in spring, which could be critical given kind of where we're headed with climate change and the influence of extreme events on nutrient export in the future for the Midwest. Okay, so just some comments. At the field scale, it's solid. Cover crops consistently reduce field scale and tile mass losses for both dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus, but really you have to emphasize that multi-year records are critical in order to document the effects. The second thing is, at the watershed scale, it's super challenging to detect. You're sort of 2 steps away from the field. And cover crops, but we do know cover crops can buffer the effects of storms, which are coming more fast and furious, and especially in spring. So regardless of whether we can say there are percentage level differences in export we know that it helps at the field scale. And that's more important for you all as producers in terms of the benefit of the conservation practice. And I think starting to talk about resilience when we have these management conversations is really important. In addition to soil health, which I think is supremely important, we're going to be facing kind of a new era. And I think that if agricultural conservation under a changing climate really has to increase resilience if we're going to stay profitable in the Midwest, and also reduce that downstream export to sensitive waterways. So that was a story from a lot of data, a lot of monitoring that went on that is still going on in Indiana. And now I want to switch where we come to Michigan, to the Paw Paw River Basin at Colleen and Aaron's invitation to work on 3 little small subwatersheds, Pine Creek and 2 parts of Mill Creek, one with cover crops and one that's mostly forest and wetlands. So we call that our reference watershed. And now we're just working at a smaller scale, but just at the watershed outlet because they aren't tile drained. So this is really kind of a true test of cover crops because we don't have the benefit of the tile drains being our sampler for the fields. And this is a lot of places in the Midwest that don't have tile drains. So this is really a huge step towards this watershed scale implementation, but being able to detect the signal. And Colleen just did a tremendous job in getting cover crops on the ground in these watersheds. So here's the start of the project in 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. And you can see Pine, the sort of focal sub-watershed, getting 29, 31, 20, 26. That's very, very high for Michigan. So awesome in that regard. And then as we moved into 2020, had the money, and she said, can we put cover crops in the reference, the Mill Creek, the low cover crop watershed for the treatment? I know it messes up your experiment. It's like, hell yes. We're not going to keep a watershed without cover crops if there's money on the table to do it and farmers that are willing to try it out. We're going to put it in. So it's not the perfect experimental design because working lands aren't an experiment, right? So she put those in, moved from 6% to 16% in Mill Creek. And then there's this little forested piece that doesn't really have good farmland in it and serves as a reference of what maybe a reference non-farmed watershed looks like. So, bottom line, 1,000 plus acres were planted, about 60% cover crop coverage overall. It's a really great success story. And we use the same type of sampling to get at the benefits. Nutrient sampling every 14 days because we're not going to miss a signal. We did pre-cover crop sampling and then up until September 2018 and then started the cover crop planting. And I'm going to show you data in the fallow period, but we also have it year-round for the cash crop period as well. And the big difference between this and the Chateau Ditch and Kirkpatrick Ditch project is that not only did we measure soil nitrate and soil phosphorus, or dissolved nitrate and soluble reactive phosphorus, or dissolved reactive phosphorus, but also Aaron and Colleen asked us to do E. coli, because E. coli are super important sort of signature of manure contamination that you might see down system that is pretty high profile and gets a lot of attention. So can cover crops mitigate E. coli in these waterways? And no one had ever done that. We searched the literature, not been done. So no one's ever even talked about cover crops in that sense, and that was Colin's idea. So let me show you the take home for the nitrate and the phosphorus. So here's daily nitrate, here's daily phosphorus from the 3 different watersheds. There's the little color coding, and that's where we started with the higher cover crops. Then we added in the second year into the tan one, and then gray is our reference. And you can see that, boy, in 2019 we thought we were there. Like 21% reduction with cover crops at the watershed scale. We couldn't show that the first year for Chateau. We did it here. I was very excited. And then came 2020. And then 2021, we got another sort of 18% decline. But what you can see out of the 4 years of data that we had is it is interannually variable, right? And that's because the water is varying. The same for phosphorus. It was Year 1, a 13% reduction, and year 4, a 32% reduction in phosphorus. But you don't see any increases, right? You don't see any increases, but it just can we detect a watershed signal of decline. And 2 out of 4 again. So the thing that I would say is the work here in Michigan has confirmed that this watershed scale testing at the outlet is super challenging to do. If we can do it closer to the field or in the field, that's where you can sort of consistently detect those benefits for nutrients. But they can reduce these nutrient yields during the fallow period. We just have to be really persistent about that signature. And storm-driven runoff, that is what is going to be our enduring challenge. So here is how we broke out water coming off the landscape, nitrate export, and phosphorus export by the different flow levels. And all I want you to focus on is the dark colors. The dark colors is the top 10% of flows coming out of the watershed, and that's when the nutrients leave. So the majority of nitrate and dissolved reactive phosphorus is happening during storm events, what we call either high or moist flows, and that can be up to 25% of export. 25% is the number, the kind of range we're talking about for the effective cover crops. And that can be blown out of the water by storms. So if we don't start measuring things at the right place all year round and accounting for what's happening with high flows, we're never going to prove that practices, just one tool in the toolbox, but this particular tool, cover crops, works for keeping nutrients on the field. I just want to show you one last little bit on soil amendments and manure application and E. coli, that piece that Colleen asked us to look at. It's a really high profile issue, and if cover crops can make a dent on E. coli, boy, that would be an extra added like icing on the cake. Again, here's 2019 through 2022, pine, mill, and the forested. So remember the high cover crop is in green. And I also show you both the fallow period and the growing period. Sampling year-round was very instructive for this. What we saw is when you really see those E. coli challenges is during the growing season, not during the fallow season. Not sure that cover crops then is the right practice to sort of help mitigate this because it's not working during the growing season, it's working during the fallow season. But we did see 1 out of 4 years, a huge reduction, 73% reduction in E. coli from the watershed outlet with cover crops. But we didn't see it in the other years. There were just no differences among those watersheds. So we learned a lot from doing this. It's not probably going to be the silver bullet that sells cover crops to everyone, but it is good to know that if cover crops can keep particles on the field, soil particles and manure-related particles on the field, you could prevent E. coli contamination. Okay, I just said all that. Finally, Erin did a great job talking about what's next. I just wanted to highlight this particulate transport as after manure has been applied to fields. This antimicrobial resistance is a big deal. There may be regulations coming down the line from USDA. I can tell you that USDA is funding programs now on studying antimicrobial resistance in the environment. So it's on the radar. We need to have some data to show them what's happening in the landscape on working lands if we want to sort of get out in front of this. And that's this new USDA grant that we've got with Kyle Bibby, another faculty member at Notre Dame. He's an environmental engineer. And I've got 2 graduate students working on this project. Emma and Mitch are both in the room. They're over in the corner there. They'd be happy to answer. Raise your hands, guys. No, not quiet over there. Yes, Emma and Mitch are over there. And they've been studying the transport and latent transport, basically, of ARGs in the environment. So again, as Erin said, this antibiotic use is a global issue associated with agriculture, and antibiotics are excreted untransformed out the back end of organisms. And so this is the challenge when you apply manure to fields, but they don't know anything about what aging manure, how long, digestion, all of that's a new frontier. Digestion, for example, could take care of the ARG issue. They haven't done it on working farms. to know. And so that's kind of where we're coming in to do some work in the watershed. I think that runoff events is the real time, the time when you get precipitation on fields, that's the time we're vulnerable. I think, with things like cover crops, maybe we can prevent runoff to waterways and, in turn, prevent this ARG contamination in the landscape. So, in addition to the E. coli monitoring that we continue to do, we're going to measure ARGs to inform these either mitigation efforts or get out in front of any sort of regulation that could be coming on the pipe. Okay, just to close, this is Colleen's diagram. She's genius at this stuff. I never really thought of it this way, but what you see on the surface with cover crops when you're driving on the highway and you see, oh, there's a field, and there's a field, and there's a field. That's just all the tip of the iceberg. Underneath is all the benefits that you can see happening, and there are so many. If water quality is not resonating with you, I bet you there's a soil health metric that will. Give this type of practice a shot, and what I've shown is that persisting with it for a few years, 5 to 8, can really reap some benefits that I think people give up on a practice too soon. Okay, I'm going to end. I'm probably long. Buren Conservation District. You guys have got some stars. They're known all over the Midwest. So thank you to Colleen for the invitation, to Carly and Aaron. This water quality team is some of the best in the business. Also, we wouldn't do what we do without the farmers and the landowners that want to sample the waterways in their fields. It takes a village of partners. It takes even more of a village of funders. It's been an honor to talk with you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at the break or at lunch. But thanks so much.
Okay, so we're going to bring Neal back up here. And, I called Neal. I think he was surprised. I don't know if I accidentally called your personal number. And I called him and I said, I want to bring you back. What are you talking about right now? What are people having you talk about? And he said, people want me to talk about soil health. And I'm like, okay. I feel like we've already talked about that so much. He's like, but I can do whatever you want. So, I said, let's talk about soil health. I wanted to have a basic session. We have a lot of different agriculture here. Last time he came, he talked about vegetables. He talked with our vegetable group. He talked with our fruit group. This year we've added on livestock. He was telling me how his number one customer, or the most customers he gets currently, are from New Zealand, and they're grazers. And he helps fix their grazing pastures. Well, then he told me that, I asked him a little bit more about the soil health, and he told me that soil health is he said, what did you say? You said something along the lines that having the balance in the soil is so important for soil health, and I have a great talk on that. So I said, okay, let's talk about this. So he's going to talk about soil health a little bit, but I think you're going to really talk about balancing soils, or managing fertility. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to let Neal do the job. So let's give Neal a round of applause. He's going to speak for about an hour and a half.
My apologies to those of you on the far side of the room, but I have to use my computer. That's my notes. So if I get away from here, I might forget and get off track, and we'd never get done. But thank you for having me, and I hope I stay close enough to the microphone, and if I don't, please wave and have me get back up here so you can hear me, because when I get started concentrating, sometimes I lose track of where my mouth is. Been consulting since 1973, and just for those that aren't familiar with what we do, we use soil tests, and from those try to help farmers get the correct fertility for whatever crop they're growing and whatever soil they may have to work with, whether it's all the way from light sands to heavy soils to soils that are just severe problems. We use aerial photos, yield maps, EC zones, and GPS technology, anything to get to hone in on areas so that it's easier to get them fertilized. We used to be able to show farmers, this is the best part of your field, and they'd say, yes it is, but how am I going to get the fertilizer truck to turn around on these other parts and put more and put less here? That was the big problem until GPS. But as far as I'm concerned, GPS is the best thing that's happened for being able to correct fertility, and our company uses people that use GPS, but I'm not in the business of trying to get people to use GPS. I just say I think it's the best thing that's happened for fertility since learning about how the soil works, for me at least. We also conduct introductory training programs and various presentations, and we do on-farm consultations. This is an optional service that through W&K Precision Ag, some clients use, some don't. But some type of GPS, or if you use grids and set up zones, it actually serves to have a much broader area. A question was asked last night. Well, what's a good size zone? The best size zone is the zone you will fertilize separately. If you've got something different and you say that's too small, I can't treat it separately, then don't sample it. Stay out of it. Look at where are the places that you can do the sampling and then do what's necessary. Some farmers, when we start, will say, "Oh, I can't do less than 10 acres," and then it gets down to 5, and it gets down to 2, and then sometimes it'll get down to, "Well, you know that little problem spot there? If you tell me what to do, I'll do it." Where do you begin if you want to have both high quality and high yielding crops? We're not looking for one or the other. We're trying to help you, because what we find is no matter what crop you're growing, the better you get the fertility in that soil, it's not just going to be a better yield or better quality. And some people say you can't have both. Yes, you will have both if you supply the proper nutrients. And it happens time after time after time. You don't have to sacrifice yield for quality, and you do not have to sacrifice quality for yield. If you're a wine grape grower sitting in this room, you might think, "Oh, that's not right." It is, even for wine grapes. I don't expect you to believe it till you see it for yourself. Everything I'm telling you today is to try to get you to look at something and say, that might help me. And how do I implement that? We're not trying to convince everybody in the world to use our service, because we couldn't take care of it anyway. What we're trying to do is give good ideas, and then if a person says, "I don't know how to accomplish that any other way," we'll be glad to work with you and try to help you accomplish that. All soils have at least one thing in common. They need living organisms to feed the crops. If you have a dead soil, you're not going to have a good crop. Russian soil microbiologist Ines Krasilnikov judged fertility by counting the number of microbes present in the soil. And after working with this all his life, and his work was done back in the 1900s, but it's considered important enough that USDA actually had it translated into English, and it's available online to go and get the research that he's done. But he made the comment, soil fertility is determined by biological factors, mainly by microorganisms. The development of life in the soil provides it with the property of fertility. Fertile soil is created by microorganisms. Where this life is dead or stopped, the former soil would become an object of geology, not biology. The rocks off the moon, the soil that they brought, quote soil, the rock they brought back from the moon really wasn't soil. It didn't have any life in it. If you don't have life in it, you got to get some life in it before you grow anything. Dr. William Albrecht, that I was privileged to study under, used to point out, you can take a soil and take all the humus out of it. Take all the humus out of that soil and plant a seed in it, and it will not germinate. But he said, just as soon as you put a minute amount of humus in that soil, that seed will germinate. And his point was, life comes from life, not something dead. Healthy living soil. This study was done by Pimental and some others in the group in 1995. But the biomass of organisms in the top 20 centimeters of a healthy living soil were measured. And kilos per hectare, if you take that and reduce it by 10%, that's basically pounds per acre. So there's 1,700 kilos per hectare of bacteria. Well, take 170 pounds off that. Let's just take 200 off. There's 1,500 pounds per acre of bacteria in in our soil. Each acre, on average, will have a good healthy soil, 1,500 pounds. Fungi, take off 300, 2,400 pounds. What I'm using this for is to say we're feeding a whole lot of stuff before we feed our crop, because all these eat at the first table. And what the crop gets is what's left over or what's given back from the life in that soil. So soil organisms need nutrients too, and if you consider and add up all the things that are on here, it's like feeding almost 6,000 pounds of livestock per acre, even if you don't even have a fence. If you say, I don't have any animals on the farm, you're feeding 6,000 pounds worth of live stuff somehow. And if you think they don't get what they need before your crop does, think about one thing. What happens if you have too much residue and don't have enough nitrogen to break it down? The crop's what suffers. That's one really good example as far as I'm concerned. But basic soil science, we hear there are three arms to it, or three parts to it: chemistry, physics, and biology. And that's right. But which part is it that we need to concentrate on? If we want to have growing crops and so forth, we got to concentrate on making sure the biology has what it needs, from the plant root to everything that supports that plant root. But in order to have that biology, we need the right amount of air and water in the soil. That comes back to the physics of the soil. But if you don't have the physics of the soil, that means we don't have the right amount of air and water for the life in that soil. Not just the plant, but for all the other things that support it. The only way you change that physical structure is by using chemistry to affect that structure. That's the only way I know. Most textbooks, I don't know of a textbook that tells you if you don't have a good soil, if you don't have the right physical structure, what do you do to get it? The only way I know to tell you is what you measure in terms of a soil test. Farmers and growers say, oh, my soil is different. And you know what? You're right. Your soil is different. But how many different soils do you have on your farm? Some of them quite radically different. If you have some sand and some heavier land or whatever. The point being, as long as we have a good standard of measurement, that's what we need. Something that we can look at. If you've got a sandy soil, if you've got a poor soil, if you've got a good soil, whatever it is, can you identify it? Can you pick it out from a soil sample? The only way to do that is be consistent in the sampling that you're doing. A recommendation for a soil is only as good as the test you pull. If you're sloppy in the test, it's going to be a bad recommendation, most likely. How many different types of soil do you have on your land? And yet, no matter how many or how different the soils on the land may be, they still need the right fertility to provide top yields and quality. Any difference you can see on a field, if the crop grows differently, if the soil is a different color, if you got more of a slope, if anything else, if you got a field that slopes, even if it looks level, if you can determine which way the water runs and split that field in half, where the water runs from will have the lowest fertility and the lowest nutrient holding capacity. As a general rule, that holds true in the whole world. And the low end will have the highest fertility and the most nutrient holding capacity, because where the water runs, the soil colloids move. The light the very small clay particles that attract and hold fertility move with the water. When we have erosion, whether it's wind or water, we're losing the most fertile part of our soil first, every time. You can't manage what you can't measure. How do you measure that? Well, that's what we're going to try to talk about today, and that is, unless you have a good soil test that you can count on. And how do you know that? Test your soil tester. Test your soil test. See if somebody does a test for you, and you've got one area that's really good and another area that's really bad. Well, pull the sample, but don't say good and bad. Pull the sample and call it 1 and 2, or whatever you want to call it. And then ask whoever's doing the interpreting, which one of these is the best soil and why? Or which one is the worst soil and why? A soil test should be able to tell you that, as long as that soil test is one that you can understand. I can only understand the soil test that we use. And do you know why? Because every soil test lab does tests differently. The numbers are going to be different. And I can't look at any other soil test lab's numbers and tell you what I can tell you from looking at the ones we have. I can guess, but Dr. William Albrecht used to he told us, don't try to read someone else's soil test. You'll be wrong. Over 50 years now, I've had a few dozen times when someone's convinced me to try to do it. Every time I've been wrong. Once we get a test and comes back, every time I've been wrong. And it wasn't that I was trying to be wrong, but I was using the numbers I understood, and the numbers on that soil test were different. So, first thing you have to have is some way to measure the fertility, and then someone who understands what that measurement means. There are many soil tests, and there's nothing. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with another soil test. I'm only saying I don't understand them. Don't know if this makes sense to you or not, but you know what? The French and the English use the same ABCs. But if you write a book in French and it's got all the answers in it that I want to know that I don't know how to answer about agriculture, I'm not going to be very good at that because I can't read French. It's the same ABCs. Every soil test lab uses the same set of numbers, but it's a different language. It's like learning the difference between French and English. You got to know what that number means when you're out there in the field. And that means I'd have to try to memorize everything from everybody's numbers. Look, I do well to remember what I'm supposed to remember from one set of soil samples, let alone trying to know how to tell you what to do from everyone's. So this is what we tell people. If you want to have, if you want to have a good, quick, fast answer, and that's all you want, you can use whoever. We're not in the business to try to do everyone's sample. We're trying to do the best job we can to help the person who wants to do the best job they can on their soils and in terms of the quality of what they're growing. A while ago, Colleen mentioned about that we did the most samples of grass from New Zealand. We do get more samples from grasslands in New Zealand. We don't get more samples from grass all over the world. The number one crop we get samples for is corn. We do more corn than anything else. Probably next is grass, and then third is actually grapes. We get a lot more from those three crops than we do most others. And why is it? Well, corn, lots of acres. And it's an area that where I grew up, we grow a lot of corn, and people tell people. As far as grass, those guys in New Zealand, many of them have soil just like yours. They have soils that are deficient in magnesium, but nobody tells them. And as soon as you correct that magnesium, they can tell the difference in grass growth in 4 weeks. In 4 weeks, because they measure what kind of tonnage they're making. They're growing grass year-round for their basically dairy cows, but still the same for sheep or whatever. But they can measure that, and they say, we got this much increase because they have devised methods to figure out what kind of tonnage they're producing and how much difference it makes. That's one of the big reasons we receive more samples from the little country of New Zealand than we do from any state, including Missouri, where I'm from, in the United States. More samples come, and they ship them all over here to be tested because we can't read the test from where that is, but because of the results they get. The second largest crop that we get from New Zealand is grapes. More samples from grass and grapes than any other crops we get there. Testing the soil and understanding how to interpret what the tests reveal in terms of actual nutrient needs provide the guidance for producing the best quality and yield. First, what we want to do is build a person's trust. We're not trying to talk people into doing everything at once. What we try to say is, do a test. It'll take maybe 2 or 3 years sometime before you know for sure that's what it was. But once you see it work, it's going to get harder for somebody to talk you out of it. If you haven't seen it work and you do it 1 year and something happened, oh, that doesn't work anymore. And that's one of the chief things. I'd rather have you do just a few acres and make sure you say, well, yes, if I do this, it's going to help me. And then once you know it's going to help, go from there. Spatial samples, an arborist from California sent me a dozen samples. He called and said, you probably won't want to work with me. I'm only going to send you 12 samples. I said, we work with one sample. We'll work with somebody's garden or rose garden or flower garden or whatever, as long as you're wanting to find out what to do. Well, those 12 samples, he called back and said, every sample I've done this year, I got to send back to you from another lab because I haven't gotten anything like that. Well, here's the reason I put that in. I don't know how much those plants cost in those pots that are around that swimming pool. But you know what? He said, I take a sample at every pot because the fertility is so different from one to the other because the gardener comes along, well, that doesn't look too good, and throw 2 or 3 handfuls of something in there. And he said, when I take those samples, I'm going to take about at least 5 and up to 10 probes out of each one of those pots to send in to see what to do. And the next question is, how deep do you take that sample? If everything's going to be put on top, and that has to do with anything you're growing. If all the fertilizer is going to be put on top, take a 4-inch sample. If you want to see what's below 4 inches, take a subsoil sample down below that. Because what you're going to influence in 12 months is about 4 inches. That's what's going to make that's where you're going to make the big difference from the time you put it on until next time around. Always follow sampling instructions provided by the laboratory. The reason I put this in is because if it's no-till, if it's an orchard, if it's a garden, if it's a vineyard, if it's lawn grass or turf grass, we recommend a 4-inch sample. If you take one deeper than that, it's going to make it look like you need more than you ought to put on, because the deeper you go, the more it looks like you need. So, as a consequence, we'll say, if you're going to work your soil, if you're going to work that soil even 2 inches deep, then take a look at the aerobic zone, which is generally somewhere between 6.5 to 7 inches. Some will be a little deeper. Some may not be quite that deep. But an average soil is considered in 1 acre to weigh 2 million pounds if it's 6 3/4 inches deep. Take 1 acre, take all the soil that's there, 6 3/4 inches deep, and that's considered approximately 2 million pounds of soil. We mark our probes at 6 3/4 inches. But when we go in and pull a sample, if it's going to be a soil that's going to be worked, we take a 6 3/4 inch sample. If it's not going to be worked, we take a 4-inch sample. This is the ideal soil. This is what we're told in textbooks. It's the ideal soil. Half of it's solids. That's the organic matter and the minerals. The other half is pore space. We need half the soil needs to just be pore space. And out of that pore space, 25% of the total, or 50% of the pore space, should be air and the other water. If you're looking at staying alive, what's the 4 things you'd probably pick out that we need to stay alive? Shelter, food, water, and air. Which one can we do without the longest? Probably shelter, unless we're in an awful bad situation. But which one can we do without the least? Air. We can't get along without air for very long at all. Do you think the soil is any different? When we start looking at a soil, air and water are the 2 things we most concentrate on. That's the short-range differences. How do you keep that air and water there in an ideal soil? An ideal sand is not an ideal clay. Because what is the problem with a clay soil? Generally, too much water and not enough air. And the problem with a sandy soil, generally too much air and not enough water. That's 2 different problems we're dealing with. When you're going on sand, you need a completely different program than you do when you're going on clay. We need something to decrease the pore space and increase water holding capacity on sand. We need something to increase pore space and increase the air content in heavy clays. Completely different program for both. We're going to talk about that a little bit today in the various presentations. Air and water. That's the 2 things that really we're looking at. And tell me what book tells you how to get the right amount of air and water in a soil in terms of any textbook I've ever seen. Never seen one. Never seen one. Because most people do not think you can make any difference. Most people don't think you can. Most soil physicists say, you got what you got. If you work and compact it, well, maybe you can get the compaction out. But what I'm telling you is the chemistry of the soil determines the physical structure, which then determines the house, how much air and water is there for the biology. The fertility side is feeding the food portion. The food portion is a part, but also the physical structure is an important part. When we start looking at a soil, the relationship between the physical structure of a soil and its exchange capacity and base saturation percentage is the only way I know to have an effect upon how much air and water will be in that soil. And what does that mean? Soil textbooks teach us about this physical structure, but they really don't teach us what you do if you don't have it. What do you do if you don't have that ideal soil? And how do you know if you do or not? The ideal soil, this is what we need, but if you don't have it, how do you get it? The physical structure of a soil can only be brought into alignment with the textbook definition of a soil by an understanding of exchange capacity and base saturation procedure. I don't know how to do it any other way. I don't know anybody else that knows how to do it any other way. You can make some guesses and say, well, we're trying to raise the fertility, but does that affect the air and the water? And how can you know if it does or not? What I'd tell you is, once you get the numbers to the right place, you can hire a soil physicist to come in and take a look and say, is this right or not? But generally you can tell for yourself. Take a soil probe. Go into your soil, push it down into the soil. This is much easier in clays than sand. But in a clay soil, push that down and just take the probe and lay it down flat, a probe that has one side cut out so you can look at the soil sample. Just take it and lay it down flat and start when you pull the sample out, start it down as deep as you've gone. If you go that way, it's going to be hard. But if you go up to the top, the very top where you start from, in other words, the very top soil, and let's say this is when you pull the sample, this is the very top of the soil probe sample. All right? Lay it down like so, take your thumb, start pressing at the very top, and feel what kind of resistance you feel to that thumb. If you can only go about half an inch before you start feeling it's harder, you're going to have about 20% magnesium or higher in that soil, most likely. If you can go down about 2.5 inches, you're going to have magnesium in the teens. So it's still going to be hard, it's still going to lack the right amount of pore space. If you can get 4 to 5 inches down with that thumb before you feel resistance to your finger, to your thumb, that soil is generally going to have the right balance of it's going to be very close to the right balance of calcium and magnesium. You can tell that just by going in. Now, if you're pulling that out of a place where you run a bunch of tractor tracks over and it's all compacted, you're not going to feel that. Get up in the row where the soil is not packed or disturbed. Well, that preferably even the soil where it's had time to be worked and then it's been settled back down again by rainfall or weather or whatever. That's a good general rule. You can recognize by looking at it most of the time, but I just wanted to give you something to take a look at. So achieving the right physical structure, well, before correcting the calcium and magnesium really is the key, because calcium and magnesium are by far the most important and influential of the 4 elements that we need for achieving right soil structure. It's the 4 elements that most affect pH in land that we farm: calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium. Out of those 4 elements, about 90% of the soil's nutrient holding capacity should be occupied by those 4. If you've got 85%, between 85 and 90% would be the ideal, depending on what you're growing. If it's grapes, it needs to be a little higher. If it's grass, maybe it could be a little lower. But when we start looking at the soils, an ideal soil needs 60 to 70% calcium, 10 to 20% magnesium. That's 80% right there. And 5 to 7.5% potassium and 0.5% sodium. When you add all those up, calcium and magnesium are the 2 that have the most influence. That's what really we need in a soil. And Calcium had one job in the soil, and magnesium and potassium and sodium have a different job in terms of physical structure in the soil. You can find this in the literature if you look, but most of the time it's not reported, and most textbooks don't tell you this. Calcium's job in the soil is to actually cause the clay particles to flocculate or aggregate together and clump. They cause the clay particles to clump up. As those clay particles pull together, guess what it does? It doesn't make the soil stopped up. It actually increases the porosity of the soil. Calcium is the key to getting the right porosity as long as you don't put too much. Put too much, now it gets too loose. Gets too much airspace. Magnesium, potassium, and sodium have the opposite job in the soil. They disperse the clay particles. They push them apart, and they actually reduce the pore space. What happens then? When the water tries to move through, it clogs up. That's the important reason why if you have an excess of sodium in a soil, if you have an excess of magnesium in the soil, or if you're a person that has used too much manure and have an excess of potassium in the soil, the first key to getting rid of that is get your calcium above 60% saturation in that soil. If you don't, and you put sulfur on and try to drive those others out, it's only going to take out more calcium. It'll actually make your soil tighter instead of loosening it up. The reason is the calcium makes bigger pore space, and the other nutrients as they're moving up can't stop it up. We're just talking about a matter of what do we have to do to get the nutrients to move through a soil. The best possible yields and quality can only be achieved on soil with the proper structure already in place. I cringe when I get a sample from a blueberry grower that says, we have a bad problem. And the reason I cringe is because to get blueberries to do their best, you should have that soil in shape before you plant the blueberries. Don't wait until afterward to find out what the problems are. I'd say that's really best for any crop, but especially for blueberries, and the reason being, blueberries will grow in some soil that a lot of other things won't grow in. But what's generally the key that they grow in? Manganese and iron. They get good manganese and good iron. That's why so much of the literature that you read about blueberries says, don't put any calcium on blueberries. It may kill them. Why is that? Because when you put calcium on a soil, it has an effect on the availability of iron and manganese. And the lighter the sand, the easier it's going to be to kill those blueberries with too much calcium. Sometimes it doesn't take, by putting the right amount on, it's too much, because unless you know to come back and put the iron and the manganese on, that it's going to cancel out, those blueberries are going to get in trouble. But if I have a client that says, we want to plant blueberries here, what do we need to do? I recommend you do the same thing we recommend to grape growers, and that is start 3 years ahead of time. Start looking at that soil 3 years ahead of the time you want to plant it. In the 1990s, prices of grapes went down, and I had a presentation on the West Coast. One of the men came to me after, and he said, Neal, we were getting ready to plant another 3,000 acres of grapes. But he said, this 3-day course you've given, we're putting a stop to it. He said, we're going to come in there and put on what needs to be put on, get those soils in the right shape. And 1, 2, or 3 years from now, when you say those soils in the right shape, that's when we'll plant the grapes. They are still clients today. That was the 1990s. And the owner has taken me to various vineyards and say, look, this is when we planted before we got the ground in shape. This is when we planted after we got the ground in shape. You can see it with your eye. All you do is just drive through and look. Physical properties, that's really the house for the biology. That's the house for that 6,000 pounds of organism we're trying to feed. If we don't have the right house, you can buy microbes all day long and put in there, but if you don't have the right environment for them to survive, how can we expect they're going to do the best job? The Albrecht system of soil fertility is the only system I really understand. But you know what, Dr. Albrecht, when he was hired, he was head of the soil department when I met him. Well, he was actually retired professor emeritus of soil department when I studied under him. But Dr. Albrecht was actually hired at the University of Missouri as a soil microbiologist. That was his job. to teach farmers how to use microbial inoculants, specifically rhizobium inoculants on legumes. Back in the time he started, about 1918 or so, there wasn't that much understood about rhizobium inoculants for pasture use or for legume use and so forth. He started out by putting inoculants on soils for the state of Missouri from the early 1900s all the way through until maybe the last 2 or 3 years. Nebraska may be now ahead of Missouri. But until all that time, Missouri was the number 2 cow-calf, had number 2 number of cow-calf operations in all the United States. Texas had the biggest amount. Missouri had the second most amount. Now, numbers-wise, not number-wise in terms of number of cow-calf operation, not necessarily acreage-wise or what size livestock operation. But they were number 2. We had more cow-calf operations than any other state but Texas. Missouri's always concentrated on, what do we do to get legumes in those pastures? Well, that was Dr. Albrecht's job at that time. And what he said was, if we can get these farmers to understand, you got to put one inoculant on for alfalfa, you got to put another one for clover, you got to put another one for lespedeza, then we can solve these problems to grow better pastures. Well, guess what? They got farmers to do it. Some of the farmers said, this is great. This is just what I needed. Other farmers said, this is the worst thing I've ever done. Didn't help me a bit. I just wasted that money and time. Some farmers said, well, it worked over here on this part of the pasture, it worked over here on this part, sure didn't work over here. So they set out to look, why did it work in some places and why did it not in some place else? And he said, to get the biology, the environment that it needs, the only way you get that is to change the chemistry. That's what they found. They looked to see, where is it that the legumes are growing the best? What kind of nutrient levels are there? Where is it growing the worst? What kind of nutrient levels are there? And then they set out to correct the ones that were not, to get the ones that were not growing well to look like the ones where they did grow well. This is where this whole program came from. It was not a matter of just saying, what kind of fertilizer can we sell? It was a matter of saying, what kind of fertility do we need? And let's work to do that. And all of a sudden, now this was for legumes, but all of a sudden, some of the dairymen, if it was alfalfa, well, 5, 6 years go by, they take it out of alfalfa and put it in corn silage. And they said, this is not just the best alfalfa we've ever grown, this is the best corn silage we've ever grown. And then others looked at it, well, when we come in and put a solid stand of grass or something for hay, it's not just that the legumes grow well, the grass grows much better too. Well, you know what? As time went on and Dr. Albrecht began working with soils around the world, there isn't a plant in the world, not one that I've ever seen, and we've worked with basically every food and fiber crop and lots of others, there's not a plant in the world that doesn't respond to what Dr. Albrecht defined as the ideal soil. Not one. You get it there, and it's always better. It's always better, whether it's better yield, whether it's better quality, it works. It's just a matter of what do you have to do to achieve that. Dr. Albrecht's program for optimizing soil fertility for best crop growth was based on the measurement of 4 positively charged elements: calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. These elements all affect both soil fertility and soil structure, both. The availability of each is measured by using a specified soil analysis and expressed as base saturation percentages. I don't know how to read them any other way. I don't know any other way to evaluate a soil for its physical structure. Once you get those soils in shape, then hire a soil physicist to see, well, is this good physical structure or not? If you want to do that. By the time it gets there, most people recognize, hey, this is working real well. Optimum base saturation for most soils, you're going to have a lot of people that will tell you base saturation of soils, the percentages of the nutrients don't matter at all. If you're looking at every different soil lab and trying to say, well, we did samples from all these different labs and the numbers jumped all over the place, there isn't anything to put together. What we'll tell you is look at them from one lab. Choose a lab and start looking at them from there. See what that shows you. And these numbers may not be exactly the same on the other lab as they are on ours. I can tell you, There's a lab that, the lab that we use is in Missouri. That's where I live, in southeast Missouri. But the lab that we use is in Missouri because it's the only lab in the world that I know that will run the sample the way we need them run. The only one. There are farmers that send us samples from all over the world because we can't find a lab in their country that can duplicate the numbers. It's easy enough to tell. Go out and take a soil probe and take 2 sacks, two soil bags. Take a probe of soil, put it in one, take another probe right beside it, put it in the other. Do that in 5 places. Send it to whatever 2 labs you want to send it to. But if you send it to us and you can send it to any other lab, guarantee you when it comes back the numbers will be different. I'm going to tell you that in this area, you have sandy soil that you need more magnesium in. And we'll tell you when that magnesium gets to 12% on heavier soil, that's enough. But on some of these light sands that have exchange capacities of say 5.5, you need 20% magnesium in those soils for them to work right. That 20% magnesium, for every time that exchange capacity changes, if it goes from 5.5 to 5.6, your numbers change as to what you need. Well, all I'm saying there is when our test shows that you have 12% magnesium, which on a heavy clay we'll say that's the maximum amount you need, otherwise it starts causing you a problem. It'll start causing you to have too much magnesium in the soil, will cause a magnesium deficiency in the plant. Once you get above 12%, plants have trouble getting enough magnesium. And that's important. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there's another lab. When ours is 12, theirs is 8. Only thing is, both labs say, you need magnesium between 10 and 20%. On that one, they still say 10 to 20%. We're telling you 12% is all you need. They're showing it's 8% and telling you need to put more magnesium on. It's just a matter of look at what happens in the field. And I'm not trying to run down any other lab. I'm just trying to illustrate numbers are different. Now, what difference does it make? There are experts, the leading experts in the field of agronomy. Many of them will tell you magnesium doesn't make any difference. Well, if you have less than 10% magnesium on a clay soil, you're always going to have a deficiency that can be corrected just by putting on enough magnesium to get above 10%. And that'll happen the first year. The first year, if you don't have something else that's more limiting. The other part of it is, if you get above 12% magnesium in a clay soil and you do leaf analysis, the higher it gets, the harder it is to get enough magnesium into that plant. What difference does magnesium make? Magnesium is the center of the chlorophyll, and nitrogen has to attach around it. If you don't have enough magnesium, you're not getting the efficiency out of your nitrogen. If you don't have enough magnesium in a plant. And if you have less than 10%, you don't have enough magnesium in the plant. And if you have more than 12%, this is talking clay soil, you don't have enough magnesium in the plant. On sandy soil, it changes completely because of the aeration situation. Now, in sand, we can push that magnesium up to 20% and still make a better yield than we can otherwise, and still not affect that we cause a magnesium deficiency in the plant, because that's a different problem. The problem there is too much air, not enough water. As you take that magnesium level and expand it, the Israelis did a study in the 1990s looking at magnesium in soils and what happened. And one of the things they saw was, not only when you correct a soil that's deficient in magnesium, not only do you get the benefit of the magnesium getting into the plant, but magnesium attracts and holds more water. The magnesium itself has water in between in terms of its binding. It'll actually hold water on the outside of it. When you increase the magnesium in a sandy soil to the right amount, you actually increase the amount of magnesium, which decreases pore space, but it also increases water holding capacity. Both. Now, the other side about magnesium, we talked about magnesium and why it's important for nitrogen. You can look up in all the literature, when you read about phosphate and magnesium, it tells you we have to have adequate magnesium for the plant to metabolize the phosphate. The two things that in the world that the most money is spent on, nitrogen and phosphorus, If you have too little magnesium or too much magnesium in your soil, you're actually hurting the effectiveness of both of them. You're not getting your money's worth. You got to look at both sides of this. When somebody tells you magnesium's not important, they don't understand how much effect magnesium has in the plant on the nitrogen and the phosphorus that you're putting on. So, exchange capacity and base saturation, that's the only way I know to look at how are we providing what is most needed for soil health. That's why I say this is calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium is a part of fertility. You manage the fertility, that's the first key to managing soil health. All the other things you do can help, but you don't get the right environment for the plant root and for everything that supports it. Have we done what we need to do? Relationship between soil texture and water holding capacity. Sandy soils have large pore spaces. Let the water just move on through. Clay soils have small pore spaces and hold water tightly. Too much water in the clays, not enough water in the sands. What we need to do is make sure we maximize for both. On the clays, maximize so that we can get enough air in. On the sands, maximize so we can hold as much water as possible. Dr. Albrecht used to say, study nature, not books. Take a look what happens on your farm. See what's happening that you see yourself. Now, he didn't mean don't read books. I'm sure Dr. Albrecht read tremendous amounts of books because he quoted from various ones and so forth. He didn't say don't learn from books. He said study nature, not books, and what he meant by that was if you see one thing happening in the field and the book says something else, which one are you going to believe? Today, I better say it another way. Study nature, not the computer. Because it seems like today, whatever topic you stick into a computer, you can find some people say it does work and other people say it don't. What you do is find out what works for you. And it isn't a matter you got to just take whole farms. You know, you can take a small area. I had a grass-fed beef operation in Australia, and the fellow just took 10% of his grain acreage. He said, I keep in grain 2 years, then I go back into pasture. He was feeding grass-fed beef. He just took 10% of those acres where he was going to plant grain and followed through and put the nutrients on. Within 3 years, he said, I've got to do it on everything. He had 4,000 acres, and he said, I've got to do it on everything. He did it on everything but 160 acres. He started in 1994. We were there in 2002, and he took us to that 160 acres, and he said, this is what my whole 4,000 acres looked like when I first contacted you. He had 4 different kinds of pasture mix in there, but the grass was yellow and orange and red-violet. He said, this is just to remind me what I had before we started. And he said, I can come back and look at this and think, this is what we used to try to grow cattle on. It's just a matter that if you start out, he started on a very small amount, but when he decided to do everything, he still left some so he could find out what's the difference in what I'm really doing. Is it, because it's easy to forget after a few years. What matters most? Growers need to know how to quickly treat a problem, but if all you do is treat the problem without solving it, it just keeps coming back, year after year after year. What if we could solve problems? And so to me, you solve the problem, it doesn't come back. We're not solving the problem, we're just living with it otherwise. We need long-term solutions to stop what causes the problem, not just treating the effects. The best solutions are not killing everything but the crop. So many times that's what we're looking at. The second law of thermodynamics says life only comes from life. Well, I use the example of Dr. Albrecht saying putting the humus on for seed germination. But here's another example. Soil fumigation. 1994, about 25 strawberry growers hired me to come out and put on a meeting for them because they said, we got to do something. Because in 2002, we're going to lose all of our fumigants, and when we lose those fumigants, we can't raise strawberries and raspberries anymore because we lose too much yield if we can't kill everything in that soil. They were coming in and fumigating, killing all the life in the soil. One of the raspberry growers came up to me and he said, Neal, I raised 200 acres of raspberries and I'd like to be organic. He said, I can't. He said, I run the experiment And if we don't fumigate our soils, we lose 15,000 pounds of raspberry to the acre. And he said, I can't stay in business if we can't use fumigant. You know what? He did the wrong test. He tested on the worst land he had. He took the worst land, and that's where he ran his test to see, well, can I do without fumigant? When he ran his test on the best land he had, all of a sudden he found out he's the one that ran the test. We just suggested he do it. When he ran the test, he called me and said, we didn't lose any yield at all on the best land. After that, he said, now if I get all the other land and that best land was soil that produced twice as many raspberries as all the literature said you could produce. That was the land that did the best job of surviving on its own. Not the worst land you got, the best land you got. Well, anyway, from 1995 until now, he raised 170 acres of certified organic raspberries. And he'll take you and show you those raspberries and say, take a look at these, go look at any commercial raspberries you want to look at. And he said, we win the prizes. We win the prizes for production, we win the prizes for quality, because they grow for a large organization that measures that. All I'm saying is, if we get our soils in shape, that solves a lot of problems. I'm not going to tell you. A lot of people, if you got the right soil, you won't have any weeds, you won't have any insects, you won't have any disease. I don't have a client that tells me that. I do have clients that tell me, boy, it's a lot better than it used to be. I have one hops grower, they raised 2,200 acres of hops. And he said, Neal, most of our hops are conventional, but we do have some organic hops, and we helped them from the beginning on some of their organic hops. They've been clients now for almost 20 years. First thing they said was, when I said you need to raise a cover crop, we can't. We don't get enough rain. We only get 8 inches and at best 12 inches a year. And besides that, we don't irrigate in the middles. We just have drip irrigation right up by the hop plants. So they said, we can't grow a cover crop. Under the circumstances they had then, I would say, yep, that was right. But you know what? They measured what the soil needed and started supplying it. First thing he called and said was, we grow 14 different varieties of hops, and ours is the industry standard this year for all 14 in terms of yield and quality. But the next thing he said was, he said, we're going to try some cover crops. Today they grow 2 cover crops a year, and they don't get any more rain than they did then, and it's still all drip irrigation. Are you getting the efficiency out of your soils that you really need until you get the soil right? You are not. You're not. One farmer's reaction, study requires time and effort. It takes all my time just to get the crops in and out. Let somebody else do the rest for me. That's fine as long as you get the right advice. The question is, what kind of advice do you want? Do you want what's most accurate, or do you want something real quick? Most people that call us say, I need these next week. We can't do it next week. The reason is, we tell the client, we don't make cookbook recommendations. We go over the numbers on every soil test, and we've got a computer that tries to figure it out, but we've worked 5,000 hours on a computer program. It still makes mistakes. It makes serious mistakes. We look at every one of them to be sure we're not telling the farmer the wrong thing. And that's what takes the time. Most of the time, the fastest we can get something back is 2 weeks, and many times it's 7 to 8 weeks, depending on how busy things are, because we tell every client, we don't put you in front of everybody else. The day you come in, everything else gets done before that we can possibly do before we do what comes in today. As a consequence, we just tell people, plan ahead. We've got one client in California, they grow 4,000 acres of walnuts and they buy another 40,000 acres, and they recommend every one of their clients use our program. They send samples 3 months ahead of time. 3 months ahead of time, because they say, we know it's going to take time to get these done and get them back. They've done that now for 20 years. And they just keep on saying, they say, we can't skip a year. We can't skip a year because they sell quality. If you want quick and easy, you can find plenty of laboratories that will give you a quick answer. But is that what benefits the soil and the crop? or is it short term? Anything that's worth doing is worth doing right. The real long-term solutions are not normally the easiest to accomplish. You have to put forth the effort to help even the best solutions work properly. We'll have people that'll call and say, I did everything you said to do, and it didn't work for me. If it doesn't work, there's something happening. Something we didn't know, something didn't get reported or whatever, because there's good reasons. If you can find it, I never have seen a situation where there wasn't a good reason when somebody said, oh, it didn't work. Something got missed. We missed it or they missed it. The best answer to our soil problem is how do we help our soil stay alive and well? Soil health. Providing organic matter for building and maintaining humus is always a worthy goal. Try to maintain what you have and build it up, and that can be done. It's a key to better soil biology and better crops. But the use of crop residues, manures, compost, cover crops is not the greatest key to increasing soil life. All of them are tools and all of them can help. All these practices can be helpful. They're all useful tools for soil improvement, but never confuse the use of soil improvement methods as being the best answers to good soil health. Soil health is a long-term project. It requires considerably more than just what can we do for the current crop or planting. When you send us a soil, first thing we're going to be concerned about is, what do you need to do to grow crop this year? And by the time we tell you what you need to do, most people say, that's all I can do and that's too much. I can't even do that much. They're not even getting to the place to say, what do we do for the soil? Most people aren't used to even what do you do to get the best crop. Think about this. If you have done the same thing in PK and lime and maybe a small amount of trace elements and maybe not, for years and years and years, and then you do a soil test and say, what can we do to straighten this out? And I want to do it all this year. You're trying to straighten out years and years of stuff in 1 year. How much has been taken out? Now all of a sudden you try to put it back all at once. Yes, sir, it's going to be costly. And most of the time, unless you've got a real high dollar crop, it's not a good idea to try to do it all at once. The best thing there is to have somebody who knows, what does that crop need the most? That's number one. What does it need next? That's number two. You just go down that prioritized list, and when you get to the point where your fertilizer budget runs out, that's where you stop. At least you put your money where it's going to do the most difference for that crop in that soil. And that's what we're looking at. That's what we're trying to help with. That crop and that soil. The soil is alive. It serves as the stomach of the plant. The soil is the plant's stomach. As a matter of fact, Dr. Hans Rausch, a medical doctor that worked with growers in Germany and Germanic-speaking countries in Europe, was a medical doctor, and he studied digestion in the human gut. And then when he started studying what it was that digested the nutrients for getting things into the plant, he found it was the very same organisms. But those organisms were in the soil for the plants. The soil is the plant's stomach. We mess up the stomach. It's just like messing us up. When we don't have a stomach that's working right, we don't get as good efficiency as we do otherwise. When you look at that right there, when we look at a soil, where's the activity? 70% of the aerobic bacteria are in the top 2 inches. 95% are in the top 5 inches. 70% of the humus is made in the top 2 inches. You mess that up, we're messing up the ability to grow humus. And basically, all the humus is in the top 5. All humus, enough aeration to get the bulk of all humus being built is in the top 5 inches. From grass to trees, roots feed by choice from the aerobic zone. The aerobic zone is the amount of soil that has enough aeration. You can tell that if you got an old fence and go pull out a fence post. It's as deep as that fence post rots. That's where your aerobic zone is. Generally, that's going to be somewhere between 6 and 8 inches. The aerobic zone and balanced nutrients, Dr. Albrecht always used to say, if you take a soil that's so bad, nothing will grow on it. Nothing. Measure that soil, find out what's missing, and just treat the aerobic zone as deep as that fence post rots, put the right amount of nutrients there. He said, then those plants will start growing, and they'll send their taproot through that so-called toxic subsoil without any observable adverse effects. He said that a number of times. I put this picture in because this was an herb grower, fresh market herb grower, that we worked with in California. This is a 2.5 acre greenhouse that he raised sweet basil in. One of the hardest crops to really get right. As long as you get the soil there, that's fine, but most people don't try that. But anyway, this grower sent samples on 2 areas that were really bad, and when he called to say he was going to send those samples, I said, do you have any good areas that you really like and you wish everything was like? Oh yeah, he said, it's the greenhouse where that sweet basil is growing. I said, well, why don't you send a good sample along with the 2 bad ones so you got some kind of comparison? I can tell you, oh, this is bad and this is bad, but don't tell me which one's good. Send 1 good one and 2 bad ones. Well, when they sent them and I looked at this particular one, we also asked them to tell us what they had applied for growing the next crop, because they were ready to grow the crop. When I called him back, I said, that soil with the sweet basil, that's an excellent soil. But I said, within 2 years, you're not going to be able to grow anything on it. And he laughed really loud. He said, Neal, everybody'd like to have a soil like that. I said, I would too, if you hadn't done all this to it you just put on there. They put on like 20, they were just measuring it out in terms of how many bucketfuls or things like that. They put on the equivalent of 20 tons of gypsum to the acre in that greenhouse. And they put on the equivalent of like 4 tons of limestone. They were just guessing and going out there and putting it on. The soil was in the right shape, but they just messed it up. And it was not going to last until about another 2 years. Well, they kept sending samples to us. And about 3 years down the road, he called and said, Neal, where can we get some more topsoil? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, I forgot what you said. But he said, that sweet basil all died. And we replanted it and it all died. And we replanted it again and it all died. And he said, I just want to find out, can we get some topsoil? Because we're going to have to dig all that out, put new topsoil in. And I remember what Dr. Albrecht said. Take a soil that's so toxic nothing will grow there, balance out the aerobic zone, and it'll run right through the so-called toxic subsoil. They didn't even change that soil. What they did was they built their own potting soils. And they balanced those potting soils out based on just like what a soil needed. And I said, just take those potting soils, get you some old black plastic, round black plastic, and that's black plastic sleeve you're seeing there. They put that balanced potting soil in those black plastic sleeves, planted the sweet basil in it, and it grew and sent those roots right down into that place where it would not sprout and grow. But it sent their tap roots right into it. These fellows planted in the increments, and they said, it's the highest yielding, it's the best tasting of any sweet basil we've ever grown. Balance the aerobic zone. That's the first key to soil life, first key to soil health, the first key to plant needs.
Excuse me, how long do they have to use those plastic sleeves in lieu of on the soil surface?
On there, they would, that soil is never going to correct itself unless you correct it, so they would just have to keep on. Because that soil, putting those plastic sleeves on, if you pull that off, if you put enough potting soil in there to cover the whole thing, you can still do the same thing. But they didn't have that. Okay, best possible yields and quality can only be achieved on soil with the proper structure already in place. Calcium and magnesium, let's get there. Calcium and magnesium are primary to soil structure and soil life. If you want to look at soils for dealing with soil life, the 2 things that most affect aeration and water holding ability is calcium and magnesium. And what do we need for doing that? Well, let's take a look at a soil sample. This is actually from this area. Colleen pulled the samples, sent them to us. But to try to make it bigger, I put it up here. And when you look at this soil, it has an exchange of 16.14. I say a soil between 10 and 15 is the easiest soil to work with. And if I had to choose something otherwise, then it would be a soil between 12 and 20 exchange capacity. Because it holds enough so that you got a good buffer, but it doesn't cost an arm and a leg to try to, if that were a 32, it'd take twice as much of all the nutrients in order to get that soil in for the right percentages. Now, when we look at this soil, I just put it in as an example. It's alfalfa, and in this case, the calcium levels are not in that 60 to 70% range. This is considered as ideal, 60 to 70%. They're at 76. Magnesium 10 to 20%, well, they're at 17.6, so you could say magnesium within the range, but with an exchange capacity of 16, it's better if the magnesium is between 10 and 12, and the calcium is between 68 and 70. So the calcium levels on this soil are too high, and there are some things that you could do to correct that magnesium. First thing is we could add some more calcium and push the calcium up to 80, which many soils have an 80% calcium. But when we do that, we're going to have such a terrible effect on that potassium level. So that's what we have to warn a client about. If you come in to do this, you're going to make that potassium even worse. And on alfalfa, some growers would say, oh, that doesn't matter, or potassium's too big a problem for us anyway. Well, in terms of alfalfa, most people don't want the potassium because of their dry cows. But you feed it to the milking cows, that have the hay that has the real good potassium will actually do better for those cattle. In this soil, what I would say is one of the biggest limitations that we're looking at in this portion is the potassium. It needs to be at least above 2%. That's absolute minimum. If you're below 2%, you're always going to suffer in terms of, unless you just put a lot of potassium right on at the time you need it on alfalfa, it gets hard to do. You can put it on over the season, but it gets hard to raise that potassium level. The other thing is, the sodium should be at least 0.5% up to 3%, and it's 0.24. That means the cattle that eat this alfalfa are going to want a lot more salt. Once you get that sodium up above 0.5%, every cattleman will tell you, everybody that has horses or sheep or whatever will tell you, our animals eat a lot less salt than they used to, because they're trying to eat that salt to get the sodium. Once you're above 0.5%, we had one cattleman, and he called and said, I want you to do the same thing for me that you did for my neighbor. What was that? Well, his cows eat half the amount of salt mine do, and we used to have the same amount of salt. He said, after he sent sample to you, his cows started eating less salt. It was because he was below 0.5%. On pastures, on every pasture, on every hayland, on anything, if you're growing livestock, have that sodium above 0.5%, because it's a whole lot better for the plants to process that sodium and the stock use that than put it out there free choice, whatever we're talking about. Okay, biggest limitation there at the top, potassium, but as we go down, nitrogen is based on the humus content. 1.7 humus, you're always going to have a 53 as that's the nitrogen that only comes from humus. Has nothing to do with anything else. How much you put on, how much comes from legumes, how much comes from manure, that's only based on the humus content. The sulfur should be, for livestock, at least 20 minimum. Ideal is 50 parts per million. When we start looking at the phosphate, well, the Olsen value here is 80. That means that the phosphate level is good, but this soil tends to get a lot of manure used on it, but still, they haven't used so much manure that phosphate is an issue here. Phosphate actually could be up on an Olsen test, and we use an Olsen for any pH that's above 7.5. 7.5 or above, we'll look at the Olsen rather than the P2O5 value. And that Olsen can be between 125 and 150, and that's considered ideal. The thing about phosphates is when you overdo, generally when we see a problem with when you overdo compost or when you overdo manures, the phosphate levels keep going up. There's a whole lot more phosphate in our soils than what we have when we measure what's there for the plant to use. What we're measuring on this test is what's there in the form the plant can pick up and use. There's a lot more phosphate than that in the soil. As a general rule, if we do a total phosphate test, it's not unusual to find 1,000 or 2,000 pounds of P2O5 phosphate in a soil. Not unusual at all, but it's not available to the plant. But when you start putting manure or compost on, you stimulate microbial activity in that soil, and the first two things you see go up is phosphorus and potassium. As long as you do that in moderate amounts, it doesn't tend to cause a lot of trouble. When you start overdoing it, then all of a sudden you start to see these excesses come. I enjoy being able to tell a farmer, look, you can use more manure or more compost. But most of the time we have to tell them, you shouldn't be using manure or compost. If they're using huge amounts of it, used to we just put none. If somebody said they want to use compost or manure and there was something that was limiting on the soil, we'd just say none. But we found out farmers didn't know what none meant. So then we started putting none at all exclamation point. And that way at least they might call it, why did you do that? Well, it's because something that you have in your soil is so high that if you keep putting more manure on, you're going to start tying up things you need in terms of nutritional value. And in terms of phosphate, what happened? Zinc. Zinc levels start to get tied up. In terms of potassium, what happens? Above 7.5% potassium, start tying up boron. What does boron do? Well, boron is necessary to get the nitrogen into your plant and utilize. Boron necessary to get calcium into your plant. Boron necessary to take the starch from the leaf and put it into the grain or the fruit. Boron is the seed of the fruit builder. You get above 7.5% potassium, and many grape growers do this, all of a sudden you start running into problems with boron. You get boron deficiency. But if the potassium and sodium together total above 10%, and we see a lot of dairy farms that have 12, 15, 20% potassium. If the higher you get above 10%, the more manganese it starts tying up, more and more and more. Zinc and manganese, two of the things that we look at for health of the livestock, for foot problems, for breeding problems. You hurt yourself by putting on too much. On the bottom portion of that same sample, tried to get this so we could blow it up a little better for you. But when we look at the bottom, basically the trace elements there, boron is 0.81. Minimum boron you want for any soil is 0.8. So they're just barely above the minimum. And if you try to grow a crop there without adding boron, you're going to have boron deficiency before the year's over. With iron, well, iron levels, anything that we see in terms of iron, we just want to make sure iron is at least 5 parts per million higher than manganese. And I've got soils that we see that have 3,000 parts per million iron. And as long as you have the other nutrients there, they'll still grow crops. Iron toxicity generally only is a problem if you don't have enough calcium. When you have too little calcium and you have an iron toxicity, correct your calcium, all of a sudden iron problem goes away. I don't know how many dairymen we've had to say, we're trying to balance our ration, but we can't get the iron under control. As soon as you get that calcium level in the soil up, they'll come and say, all of a sudden it's not a problem anymore. Calcium is a good controller of the other elements. That's a good thing as long as you need something to control. But if you put on too much calcium, it's going to drive those down to deficiency levels. Now, iron not likely, but this soil already has a manganese deficiency. Even though they don't have too much potassium, they have deficient potassium. The manganese needs to be at least 40. They're right at that, so it might be that you'd say, well, we couldn't tell the difference. But if the manganese deficiency right there is at 40, and you come in and start doing something that affects that manganese, and it goes down even further, at 38, you can see a manganese deficiency in soybean. At 38 on the test we use, about July or August when those beans are starting to ripen, you'll see really a yellowish tinge come in those leaves before it ought to come. They ought to still be green. And you can look out and see it and see that cast all the way across there. With corn, you don't generally see a manganese deficiency until it gets down to about 33. Then they'll start stunting your corn. I can tell clients when they got that, they say, well, what part of the field is this? It's out there where we got the shortest corn. They know right where it is then. Yes, sir.
Neal, did you say this was on an olefin extraction or is this mallet?
The test here, we actually have done two different, every soil test gets a P2 test done automatically. So that's already done. But then when the pH comes in above 7.5, we then have an Olsen test run, because the Olsen generally will give you a much better indication of the true availability of phosphorus in that soil. And what we find is there are some soil that it'll look like we got an extremely deficient phosphate. And when you run an Olsen, all of a sudden they have enough there and there's really not any phosphate deficiency showing up in the field. On the other hand, we'll have some that shows extremely high P2O5, and you do an Olsen test, and the Olsen shows that they're extremely deficient. In those kind of cases, we know we'd better come in there and put some phosphate on in order to help that crop.
So your initial extraction is so your initial extraction for your cata, your base?
Sorry?
For your base saturation, what's your extraction fluid?
I'm sorry, but my ears don't work well enough.
Do you use Malic 3 for your base?
No, we do not use Melic 3. Okay, let's go back down to the bottom here. Manganese at 40 or higher, we'll say that's fine. Copper above 2, it's at 1.95. So here, the copper's close, the manganese is close, the boron's close. Zinc is in great shape for an 80 Olsen. We'd say the zinc is in excellent shape for that. So in this kind of a case, what we're looking at the bottom is whether or not we have enough of the trace elements. And the pH is 7.8, and a lot of people say, well, if you got a pH of 7.8, you can't correct the trace elements. Yes, you can. You can correct the trace elements in a soil if you have a pH of 8.3, because we do it all the time. What happened with a high pH is, as your pH starts going higher, what's being measured is what you already have there and what happens to it. As the pH goes up, what you already have there, as the pH goes up, the availability goes down. But once you get whatever's causing the pH is really what's affecting it more as far as what I can tell. But once you've already got the soil and you say, we got an 8.3 pH, we can build copper levels, we can build zinc levels, we can build iron levels, we can build manganese level. Once you get to a pH of 8.4, you can still build all those except iron. Iron we can't build at a pH of 8.4. We have to switch from a ferrous sulfate to a chelated iron. But even there, you can supply iron in a high pH soil. So many of the soils in the Southwest where they grow vegetables, they don't have pHs down in the 7. They have pHs of 8, 8.2, 8.3. Some of them higher than 8.5. You know what? When they supply the nutrients, you can measure it on soil tests. Just that most people don't try it. This is the second one. This is an organic apple orchard. And I didn't say this, but about 2/3 of our clients are some type of conventional fertility program, and about 1/3 of our clients are some type of organic or natural program. If you tell us you're going organic and certified organic, we'll only make recommendations that qualify for certified organic. And what we tell our certified organic growers, if you supply the same amount of nutrients as a conventional grower, you can grow the same yield and quality, or better. We have clients that do it all the time. But I also have some clients that will come to me and say, I want to be organic. One farmer, his father was conventional, and when his father died, he came and said, Neal, I want you to change all these recommendations. I want to be organic. And I said, okay, we'll do that. I said, let me see the sample. Looked at the samples, and I handed them back to him, and I said, Larry, if you try to go organic, you will go broke. Because his soil was the classic trap for organics. His calcium was too high, and his potassium was too high, but his phosphorus was extremely deficient. And if you're organic, the only two sources you have as far as getting phosphorus levels up is either compost or soft rock or hard rock phosphate. Hard and soft rock have calcium in them. He already had too much calcium. He's going to make it worse. Compost he already had excess potassium, put compost on it, going to make that worse. I said, my advice to you is go back home, buy conventional phosphate, put it on there at this rate for 3 years, then go into your 3-year qualification, and then you can be organic. He went back and did that, and the buyers for his organic product said, this is the best we see between Los Angeles and New York. He was in southwest Nebraska. You can do it. In terms of the organic apple, well, pH is 6.7. But look, his potassium at 7.18. If he comes in there and puts more potassium on this year and pushes that up above 7.5, it's going to decrease the size of his apples. Because boron adds size. It's an idea. It's a good idea to know what you're doing. And where does he get that? Most likely from compost, because look at his phosphate level, 1,573. That's twice what we would say is the high side of excellent. Now, phosphate, I'm going to tell you the truth, if I had an excess, I'd rather be phosphate than anything. But I don't know how to get rid of an excess of phosphate other than grow it out. It's growing it out. Now, there's one thing that I want to present here. I hadn't planned on it, but I just want to say something. In talking about phosphate today, I want to ask a question to all of you that are farmers. Have you ever heard of any year when the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico decreased instead of increased? There was a year, but nobody talks about it. It was a year, I think it was 2008. No farmer quit using manure that year. No farmer quit putting on phosphate that year. Why did the dead zone shrink in the Gulf of Mexico just that one year? And then it came right back again. It wasn't farming that changed it. It wasn't farming that made that difference. It was something else. And the U.S. government ignores it, and the press ignores it. Farmers don't know about it to say anything. I don't know how many university people even know about it. But it was not agriculture that would do it. That agriculture didn't get changed that year. It was something else that was being done to the rivers, only for that one year. That's where we ought to be looking. The farmers are not really to blame for all that phosphate. I'm not saying phosphate isn't an issue. Yes, it is. But what I am saying is that dead zone is there for more reasons than the manure that we're putting on our farms. And to me, that's where agriculture ought to be concentrating right now. What caused that to shrink in one year? And now it's getting worse every year since. It wasn't what we did in agriculture. It's what was being done from somewhere else that was not allowed for 1 year. After that, the powers that be got it changed. It's been being done ever since. If we started looking at that, not one environmental group would touch it. Not one. Nobody would touch it. The newspaper didn't touch it. I don't know how to make it known, except agriculture makes it known. No ag publication even touched it. What's happening? What I say is agriculture is getting blamed for things they ought not be blamed for. And I'm sorry, but that's just the way I look at it, because soil tests tell you the truth. Soil tests tell you the truth. If you don't know what you've got, you can't manage it unless you can measure it. And my advice to you is get some tests from somewhere, and don't just do it every 3 or 4 years. See what's happening to your soil every year from somebody's soil test. And if you start seeing the numbers go down, you're not doing enough. If you start seeing the numbers go up, well, maybe we need to back up.
What changed that year? What changed that year?
What changed that year? The amount of phosphate that was being put into the Missouri River. That's what changed.
Where was the source of the source?
From soil. From soil that was being dumped into the river that was high, extremely high in phosphate. It was being done beforehand. When they stopped, it quit. And then they got a petition so they could start doing it again. Went right back up again. The environmental groups. The environmental groups. Because they wanted to build a breeding ground for sturgeon in the Missouri River. And if you took all the soil that they're putting in that river, it's like 2 trains from New York to Los Angeles being dumped in the river. High phosphate soil. They didn't even measure the phosphate in it. But that phosphate, you can measure it from the place it started all the way down to the Gulf. You go back in any other river, and it's not the same. I don't know why we can't pick up on that, but it just seems like the powers that be are not interested in it. Okay, I've got 5 minutes, and I want to cover a couple of things here. This is Tim Reinbott. He's the Director of Field Operations for University of Missouri. He came to me about 8 years ago and said, I think it's time the Albrecht system be looked at again. He said, because I'm seeing farmers that are getting good results from it, but everything I read says it's not any good, it doesn't work. So he started out with randomized replicated tests. And the part I want to talk about is the soil health. Because the soils that they had where they started already had calcium between 65 and 70%, and magnesium between 10 and, actually they had some as high as 13, but 10, 12, 13%. But take a look. What about our study after 5 years on the Albrecht recommendations? They've got the control there, and they're measuring the different types of organisms in that soil. The control with no cover crop had 2,957 pounds. With cover crop, 3,813. That's a arbomuscular or AM fungi. The recommendations had 3,388 without cover crop, 4,225 with cover crop. It's showing what now they took the recommendations and added extra magnesium. This soil didn't need magnesium. They wanted to see what happened when you put magnesium on a soil that didn't need it. Well, then it dropped down lower than the control, 2,445 versus 3,000, without a cover crop, 3,544. That's lower than the control just by adding magnesium that soil didn't need. The fungi, the gram-positive and the actinomycetes and PFLA, all of those, they're just showing, and what he says is, look, when we use the soil that Dr. Albrecht said the ideal soil, that's where we had the ideal for the microbial populations in that soil. When you get the right amount of air and water in the soil, you've got a much better environment for growing the microbes. That was after 5 years of study. They've got 7 years of study now and it's still the same. Changing the carbon, talking about adding carbon to the soil. What they're showing right here is the aggregate stability after 5 years of the Albrecht treatments. Aggregate stability, but look at active carbons right there beside it. Control 45.8, recommendations 52.3, magnesium 51.6. Even a balanced soil with magnesium is better than the control. What's the control? The control is not doing it. The control is not no fertilizer at all. The control is the normal recommended fertilizer from the university. That's what the control is.
Why did they decide to put magnesium on with the recommendation?
Just because people said magnesium didn't have any effect, and they wanted to measure, and let's see what kind of effects putting on too much magnesium has. Okay, the basics required for correcting each soil in order to achieve excellent soil fertility. This provides the foundational keys for soil health and profitable farming. And we have clients that see this all the time. Even though the best soil structure is required for ultimate in crop quality and yield, supplying needed fertility from fertilizer and soil amendments to grow the next crop should be our prime consideration. Has to be to keep everyone in business. That's what we'll try to talk about this afternoon. Principles of soil health, growing crops with the Albrecht system, this afternoon considering fertility and fertilization. Thanks very much.